Close your eyes and listen to the memory of a golden afternoon held gently in the hands of time. Before the shadows lengthened, before the world forgot how to weep, there was a city breathing with life, a vibrant tapestry woven from a million quiet moments. This was Warsaw, and within its heart beat the rhythm of a people who had built a world entirely their own. It was a world of laughter tumbling from open windows, of ink drying on parchment, of warm bread and ancient prayers. It was a spring that seemed it would last forever, a season of light that we must remember, not for how it ended, but for how beautifully it bloomed. Imagine the cobblestones, worn smooth by generations of footsteps. If you were to walk down those winding streets in the gentle light of morning, you would not feel fear. You would feel the immense, comforting hum of life. The air was thick with the scent of fresh rain on brick and the sweet, yeasty aroma of dough rising in the bakeries. Long before the sun had fully crested the rooftops, the bakers were awake, their hands covered in white flour, kneading the heavy dough, shaping the loaves that would feed the neighborhood. They worked with a quiet rhythm, a daily devotion to the simple act of providing sustenance. As the morning deepened, the city stretched and yawned. The iron grates of shop windows were rolled up with a familiar, metallic clatter. The streets transformed into rivers of movement. Men in flat caps hurried to their work, briefcases tucked under their arms. Women with woven baskets navigated the bustling markets, their voices rising and falling in the melodic cadence of Yiddish, bargaining for bright red apples, fresh greens, and the silver fish laid out on beds of ice. There was an art to the ordinary here. The tailor in his small, dimly lit shop, squinting through thick glasses as he threaded a needle, taking immense pride in the straightness of a seam. The watchmaker, bending over his workbench, listening to the delicate, ticking heartbeats of 100 pocket watches, finding peace in the predictable, mechanical rhythm of time. These were not just streets, they were the arteries of a vibrant, living culture. In the afternoons, the cafes filled with a soft, blue haze of cigarette smoke and the intense, passionate murmurs of conversation. Young men and women sat huddled around small wooden tables, their fingers stained with ink. They were poets and playwrights, philosophers and dreamers. They argued about literature, about the future, about the soul of the world. They wrote verses on the backs of napkins, their hearts overflowing with the beautiful, reckless hope of youth. In these cafes, time seemed to stand still, suspended in a shared belief that words had the power to shape the universe. And just a few streets away, a different kind of murmur filled the air. This was the deep, resonant hum of the yeshivas and the study houses. Inside those ancient walls, the air smelled of old paper and leather bindings. Grandfathers with silver beards sat beside wide-eyed grandsons, their fingers gently tracing the intricate, dense lines of the Talmud. The old men swayed as they read, a physical manifestation of their devotion, their voices a soft, rhythmic chant that had echoed through centuries. They were not merely reading, they were engaging in a timeless conversation with the divine, keeping ancient embers glowing in the modern world. For the young boys, the letters on the page were like mysterious keys, waiting to unlock the vast, profound wisdom of their ancestors. But of all the sounds that filled the pre-war air, none was sweeter, none more radiant, than the laughter of the children. The inner courtyards of the apartment buildings were their kingdoms. These were safe havens, enclosed worlds where imagination reigned supreme. In the late afternoons, when the sunlight turned the color of amber and cast long, soft shadows across the brick walls, the courtyards came alive. You could hear the sharp, satisfying click of glass marbles colliding in the dust. You could hear the rhythmic slap of jump ropes against the pavement, accompanied by breathless, sing-song rhymes. Children ran with wild, unburdened abandon, their knees scraped, their hands sticky from sweet pastries bought for a penny at the corner stand. They played hide-and-seek behind wooden carts and rain barrels, their suppressed giggles betraying their hiding spots. Mothers leaned over iron-rod balconies, shaking out rugs, their voices cutting through the playful din as they called out names, reminding their little ones that dinner was almost ready. It was a beautiful, chaotic symphony of innocence. These children did not know of hatred. They knew only the warmth of their mother's embraces, the taste of honey on apples, and the boundless, endless possibilities of tomorrow. As the week gently tired itself out, a profound and beautiful transformation would sweep over the city. Friday afternoon arrived, bringing with it a subtle shift in the very air. The frantic, busy pace of the workweek began to slow, melting into a hushed, reverent anticipation. The markets grew quiet. The shops closed their doors. The cobblestone streets, so loud just hours before, seemed to sigh and settle. This was the approach of the Sabbath, the day of rest, a sanctuary built not of bricks or mortar, but of time itself. Inside the homes, a different kind of bustling took over. The floors were scrubbed until they gleamed. The finest, whitest tablecloths were carefully unfolded and smoothed over the dining tables. The scent of the everyday was replaced by the rich, comforting aromas of the Sabbath feast. Golden chicken soup bubbled softly on the stove. The sweet, braided challah bread rested under an embroidered cloth, waiting to be blessed. And then, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the Warsaw sky in strokes of bruised purple and soft pink, the most sacred moment arrived. In thousands of homes across the city, the women approached the silver candlesticks. They struck a match, the small flame flaring bright in the dimming light. They held the fire to the wicks, watching the gentle light take hold. And then, in a gesture as old as memory itself, they drew their hands in circles over the flames, welcoming the peace of the Sabbath into their homes. They covered their eyes with their fingertips, bowing their heads in deep, quiet prayer. In that silent moment, with her eyes closed, a mother was not just a woman in a bustling city, she was a guardian of light. She prayed for health, for peace, for the safety of her children. When she finally opened her eyes and looked around the room, the flickering candlelight danced across the faces of her family. It softened the lines of worry on her husband's face. It caught the bright, eager eyes of her children. The father would return from the synagogue, bringing with him the lingering melodies of the evening prayers. He would place his hands gently on the heads of his children, whispering ancient blessings, wishing them to be like the great patriarchs and matriarchs of old. They would sit around the table, a closed circle of love and devotion. They would sing songs that spoke of peace, of angels, of a world redeemed. They would eat, they would talk, and they would simply be together. In the warm, golden glow of the Sabbath candles, the harsh realities of the outside world simply ceased to exist. Within those walls, there was only warmth, safety, and an unbreakable sense of belonging. When you think of them, do not begin with the darkness. Begin here, in the amber light of those Friday evenings. Think of the young couple taking a slow, quiet walk along the banks of the Vistula River under a canopy of stars, whispering promises of a future they fully believed was theirs to claim. Think of the solitary student in his small, drafty room, reading a book of poetry by the light of a single bulb, feeling his heart swell with the beauty of the written word. Think of the elderly woman sitting by her window, watching the snow melt from the rooftops, feeling the gentle, promising breeze of spring on her face. There were a people who loved deeply, who argued passionately, who studied endlessly, and who found profound joy in the simple, quiet rhythms of living. Their world was intricate, flawed, and utterly beautiful. It was a world woven together by the unseen threads of community, of shared history, of 1,000 small kindnesses exchanged between neighbors. The local grocer who slipped an extra piece of fruit into a poor family's bag. The neighbor who sat by the bedside of a sick child, wiping a feverish brow. The shared tears at a funeral, the shared joyous dancing at a wedding. This was the soul of Warsaw. It was a soul that breathed and felt and dreamed. It was a symphony of ordinary lives, played out on the grand stage of a historic city. As the spring days grew longer and the chestnut trees began to bud, pushing green life into the warming air, there was a collective, unspoken sigh of relief. The bitter winter was over. The sun was returning. They walked through their days with the quiet resilience of people who have always known hardship, yet have never forgotten how to find the light. They planted flowers in small pots on their balconies. They opened their windows to let the fresh breeze sweep away the stale air of winter. They looked at their children playing in the sunlit courtyards and believed, with every fiber of their being, that those children would grow to be old, that they would have children of their own, that the beautiful, enduring chain of their lives would never be broken. Listen closely to the echoes of that vanished spring. Hear the rustle of the turning pages, the clinking of the teacups, the soft, murmured blessings over the flickering candles. Feel the warmth of the sun on the cobblestones. Hold these memories gently in your mind. For this was their world. This was their beautiful, fragile, breathing world, quietly existing in the golden twilight, just before the long, terrible night began to fall. Imagine the quiet moment when a shadow first stretches across the floor of a sunlit room, changing the shape of the world without making a single sound. It did not happen all at once, this closing of the world. It was not a sudden storm that swept through the cobblestone streets, but rather a slow, creeping fog, settling gently over the eaves and creeping into the doorways. The vibrant, open city that had hummed with the beautiful chaos of shared lives began, very quietly, to shrink. It was a season of whispers, of folded pieces of paper carrying rumors, of standing on street corners and noticing that the horizon felt just a little bit closer than it had the day before. The change began with the subtle geometry of the streets. Familiar paths were suddenly altered. A walk to the market, a route traced by memory and habit for generations, was quietly interrupted by a wooden barricade. Then, the barricades became stone. The sounds of the city shifted. Beneath the familiar clatter of horse hooves and the distant ringing of tram bells, there was a new, steady rhythm. The scrape of a trowel. The heavy, dull thud of red bricks being stacked, one upon another. Gray mortar, thick and wet, sealing the gaps. They were building walls right through the heart of the neighborhoods. These walls rose slowly, cutting across intersections, slicing through courtyards, separating the baker from his oldest customer, the teacher from her school, the friend from the friend. It was a surreal geography, a map being redrawn not with ink, but with clay and cement. And yet, there was a strange, eerie quiet to it all. The people watched from their windows as the bricklands grew higher, feeling a profound, unspoken sorrow as the open sky was slowly framed and boxed away. Then came the notices, pasted to the brickwork, telling thousands of families that it was time to move. They were to leave their homes, the apartments where their children had taken their first steps, where the door frames held the faded pencil marks of growing boys and girls, and move into the newly designated quarter behind the rising walls. Imagine, for a moment, standing in the center of your living room, knowing you must leave it forever, and knowing you can only take what your hands can carry. The days leading up to the departure were filled with a quiet, heartbreaking kind of sorting. Inside the apartments, the air was thick with the dust of disrupted lives. Wardrobes were opened, spilling the scent of cedar and old lavender into the rooms. Families gathered around dining tables, not to eat, but to perform the agonizing math of survival. What do you pack when you are packing away your life? A mother stands before a heavy oak dresser. She runs her hand over the polished wood, feeling the familiar grain she has dusted every Friday morning for 20 years. She cannot take the dresser. She opens the top drawer. Here are the practical things: the thick wool sweaters knitted by a grandmother's hands, the sturdy winter boots, the flannel blankets. These must go into the leather suitcases, for the winter ahead will be cold, and warmth is more precious than gold. But then, she reaches deeper into the drawer. Her fingers brush against something small, wrapped in a soft cloth. It is a delicate porcelain teacup, painted with a tiny, vibrant blue bird. It was a wedding gift, a fragile thing that has survived a dozen years of family life. It serves no practical purpose. It will not keep the winter chill from her children's bones. But as she holds it, she remembers the quiet Sunday mornings, the steam rising from the tea, the sunlight catching the gold rim. She wraps the teacup carefully in a thick woolen sock and tucks it deep inside the suitcase, nestled safely between the heavy sweaters. It is not just a cup, it is a piece of her history. It is a promise to herself that beauty, however fragile, is worth carrying into the dark. In another room, a father is kneeling beside a small trunk. His young son watches him with wide, solemn eyes, sensing the gravity of the moment but not fully understanding the geography of their displacement. The father does not speak of walls or orders. Instead, he speaks of an adventure, of a new room waiting for them across the city. His hands tremble slightly as he folds a pair of small trousers, but he hides his shaking hands within his coat pockets, presenting his son with only a calm, reassuring smile. He makes a gentle game of packing the boy's favorite wooden blocks, carefully fitting them into the corners of the trunk. He is packing more than toys, he is packing a shield of normalcy, a desperately constructed illusion of safety to wrap around his child's heart. When the morning of the Exodus finally arrived, the streets filled with a slow, quiet river of humanity. There was no loud weeping, no dramatic outcries. There was only the steady, solemn rhythm of putting one foot in front of the other. The cobblestones echoed with the creaking of wooden handcarts, piled impossibly high with mattresses, sewing machines, bundles of clothing, and pots and pans tied together with string. It was an autumn day, and the leaves were falling from the chestnut trees, drifting down to rest on the shoulders of the moving crowd, indifferent to the profound sorrow of the procession. Neighbors walked beside neighbors. Elderly grandfathers leaned heavily on walking sticks, their faces etched with the deep lines of 1,000 unshed tears, walking with a slow, heartbreaking dignity. Young mothers carried infants swaddled tightly against their chests, humming soft, rhythmic melodies to keep the babies asleep, shielding them from the harsh reality of the street. From the balconies of the buildings they were leaving behind, those who were permitted to stay watched the procession. A woman stands on a wrought iron balcony, looking down at the handcart of the family who lived beneath her for a decade. She holds a white handkerchief to her mouth, tears streaming silently down her face. She catches the eye of the mother walking below. No words are exchanged. The distance between them is already unbridgeable. The woman on the balcony simply gives a small, trembling wave. The mother below nods gently, a gesture of gratitude and farewell, before turning her face forward, pulling the heavy cart deeper into the shadows of the newly built walls. Crossing the threshold into the enclosed quarter was a passage into a different world. The streets here were narrower, the buildings huddled closer together, casting long, deep shadows even in the middle of the day. The air felt heavier, crowded with the breath and the anxiety of thousands of newly arrived souls searching for their assigned rooms. But watch what happens when they finally find their new door. Watch the quiet resilience of the human spirit as it attempts to take root in barren soil. A family enters a small, dusty room on the third floor of a crowded apartment building. The wallpaper is peeling, the floorboards creak underfoot. It is cold, and it is entirely foreign. But the mother does not collapse. She sets down her heavy bags. She opens the leather suitcase. With deliberate, graceful movements, she takes out a brightly colored woven blanket and drapes it over the strange, narrow bed, instantly warming the corner of the room. She reaches into the trunk and retrieves a familiar copper kettle, placing it firmly on the cold iron stove. And then, she reaches deep into the suitcase, past the heavy wool sweaters, and pulls out the woolen sock. She unwraps it carefully, revealing the delicate porcelain teacup with the painted blue bird. She walks to the small, grimy window, wipes away a circle of dust with her sleeve, and sets the teacup on the windowsill. The faint afternoon light catches the blue of the bird's wing. In these small, deliberate acts, she is claiming the space. She is pushing back against the encroaching dark. With the placement of a kettle and a teacup, she is whispering to the brick walls that surround them, "We are still here. We are still a family. This space, no matter how small, is ours." As the days turned into weeks, the final bricks were laid. The archways were sealed. The heavy wooden gates were swung shut and locked. The ghetto walls were complete, a jagged ring of red and gray separating the people inside from the world they had always known. The city was divided. But inside those walls, behind the shadows made of brick, life stubbornly, quietly persisted. In the cramped, overcrowded rooms, families still gathered in the evenings. Fathers still whispered bedtime stories to their children, painting pictures of wide-open fields and towering forests using only the soft cadence of their voices. Mothers still mended torn coats by the fading light of a single candle, their hands moving with the practiced rhythm of enduring love. They were cut off from the horizon, but they had not forgotten how to look for the light. They found it in the shared warmth of a crowded room, in the gentle touch of a neighbor's hand, in the quiet, deeply held belief that the walls outside could never truly reach the sanctuary they held within. They went to sleep listening to the sound of each other's breathing, a fragile, beautiful chorus of survival, resting in the deep, unwavering hope that one day, the shadows would lift, and the walls would finally fall. Feel the chill of the very first snowflake melting against a cold window pane, a quiet messenger of a season that would ask for everything they had. When winter arrived behind the walls, it did not announce itself with a sudden, violent storm. It came softly, creeping in under the doorways and seeping through the tiny, invisible cracks in the window frames. At first, it was just a change in the light, a pale gray stillness that settled over the city, turning the breath of the people into delicate white clouds that lingered in the freezing air. The snow fell with a gentle, indifferent beauty, covering the rough cobblestones and the harsh red bricks, wrapping the enclosed streets in a deep, muffled quiet. But as the days grew shorter, a new companion moved into the crowded apartments. It was a silent guest, invisible but ever-present. It sat beside them at the table. It lay with them in the dark. It was hunger, and it slowly changed the very rhythm of their lives. We often think of hunger as a loud and angry thing, but here, in the deepening frost, it became something entirely different. It became a quiet ache, a slow fading of the light, a delicate and continuous letting go. As the cupboards grew bare and the market stalls emptied, the sounds of the evening meal began to change. There was no longer the hearty clatter of heavy pots or the joyous, chaotic conversation over a full table. Instead, there was a hushed, fragile symphony. It was the soft clinking of a single metal spoon against a porcelain bowl. It was the delicate scraping of a plate as someone tried to gather the very last drop of a watery broth. It was a symphony of empty plates, played out in thousands of rooms across the frozen city. In the center of this quiet struggle stood the mothers. If you want to understand the true measure of human endurance, you only need to look at a mother in the winter of that year, standing by a cold iron stove, trying to conjure warmth from nothing at all. Imagine a small, dimly lit room. The frost has painted intricate, icy ferns on the inside of the glass. A mother stands at a wooden table, her hands worn and thin, a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. On the table rests her family's entire ration for the day, a single, small loaf of dark bread. It is heavy, dense, and bitter, but in this room, it is more precious than spun gold. She holds a knife, and she approaches the bread not just as food, but as medicine, as time, as life itself. She performs a heartbreaking mathematics of love. She calculates the weight of a crumb against the hollows of her children's cheeks. With slow, deliberate precision, she slices the bread. The pieces are impossibly thin, almost translucent in the gray winter light. She places these small offerings onto the plates, her hands moving with the reverence of a priestess at an altar. When she calls her children to the table, her voice is steady. It is soft and calm, betraying none of the terror that grips her heart. The children sit, their eyes large and wide, taking in the meager offering. And then, the mother tells the most beautiful, tragic lie ever spoken. She smiles, pushing her own empty plate slightly away, and whispers, "Eat, my darlings. I am not hungry today. I had a little something earlier." She sits beside them, her own stomach twisting with an agony she refuses to show, and she watches them eat. She watches how they savor every single crumb, how they hold the dark bread on their tongues, trying to make it last just a moment longer. She sees the shadows beneath their eyes, the fragile thinness of their wrists, and she summons a strength that defies all logic. Because she knows that a child cannot survive on dark bread alone. A child needs a future. A child needs to dream. So, as the wind rattles the loose window panes, she begins to speak. She fills the cold room with the warmth of her memory. She tells them stories of summer afternoons before the walls were built. Her voice is a gentle lullaby, weaving a tapestry of colors and scents to replace the gray cold. She speaks of the orchards in the countryside, of trees heavy with dark, sweet cherries. She describes the feeling of the warm sun on their faces, the soft green grass beneath their bare feet, the taste of honey melting into freshly baked challah. She paints pictures with her words so vivid, so rich, that for a few precious minutes, the children forget the frost on the windows. They forget the hollow ache in their bellies. They close their eyes and listen to her soothing voice, and they are transported away from the brick in the snow, running freely through fields of gold. She is feeding their spirits, nourishing their imaginations, building a fortress of love that the winter cannot penetrate. In this quiet season, survival was not a solitary act. It was held together by an invisible web of tiny, breathtaking kindnesses. The poorer they became, the more fiercely they held onto their shared humanity. Down the hallway from that mother, an elderly man lived alone in a small, drafty room. He was a retired clockmaker, his hands trembling now, his breathing shallow. One evening, through a stroke of unimaginable luck or profound sacrifice, he came into possession of a single, raw potato. It was small and bruised, covered in cold earth. For him, it was a feast. It was a day of life. But he did not light his stove. He did not wash the potato for himself. Instead, he wrapped his thin coat around his shoulders, walked slowly down the dark corridor, and knocked softly on the mother's door. When she opened it, he simply held out his hand. He did not make a grand speech. He did not ask for gratitude. He looked at the floor, placed the earthy potato into her open palm, and whispered, "For the little ones. To give the soup some flavor." The weight of that potato in her hand was the weight of the entire world. It was a profound, silent understanding between two souls in the dark. It was the clockmaker saying, "Your children are our children. Their tomorrow is more important than my today." The mother could not speak. Her throat tightened with tears she could not shed, so she simply nodded, her fingers closing gently over the rough skin of the potato, holding it against her chest like a fragile, beating heart. As the long night stretched out, the darkness became a canvas for their private fears, but also for their quietest acts of resilience. When the children finally drifted off to sleep, huddled together beneath every blanket and coat the family owned, the parents would sit awake. In the corner of the room, by the faint, silver light of the moon reflecting off the snow, a father opens a small, worn notebook. He dips a pen into a nearly dry bottle of ink. The house is completely silent, save for the rhythmic, shallow breathing of his sleeping family. He writes. He does not write grand manifestos or political treatises. He writes to remember. He writes to record the exact shade of his daughter's eyes, the brave smile on his wife's face when she divided the bread. He pours his private terrors onto the page, confessing the deep, paralyzing fear that he is failing them, that he cannot protect them from the cold. But then, as the ink flows, his words shift. He writes about the clockmaker's potato. He writes about his wife's stories of the cherry orchard. He writes, "Today, we were hungry, but today, we still loved each other. The frost is on the glass, but the fire is still in her eyes. We are still human." He closes the book, a quiet rebellion against the erasure of their existence. He crosses the room and slips into the bed beside his wife, pulling her close. They share the warmth of their fragile bodies, an island of comfort in a freezing sea. There was no warmth in the radiators. There was no food in the cupboards. The world outside had turned its face away, leaving them to the mercy of the snow. But in those quiet rooms, amidst the symphony of empty plates, a different kind of warmth miraculously endured. It was the warmth of a mother's hand smoothing the hair of her sleeping child. It was the warmth of a shared memory, a whispered story, a single potato given away in the dark. They were enduring the unimaginable, slipping slowly away, yet they refused to let the cold freeze their compassion. They held onto each other with a gentle, desperate tenderness, proving that even when the body is starved of everything it needs to survive, the human heart can still somehow find the strength to give, to comfort, and to fiercely, quietly love. Listen to the soft, steady scratch of a pen moving across a fragile page in the deep quiet of the night. When the physical world is slowly taken away, when the streets are walled off and the open sky is reduced to a small, gray square above the rooftops, the human spirit must find a new place to breathe. In the cramped, shadowed rooms behind the brick boundaries, where the pale daylight struggled to reach through dusted window panes, a different kind of light was being carefully cultivated. It was not a light you could see with your eyes, but one you could feel in the stillness of the room. It was the quiet, determined glow of memory. The people trapped inside realized that the deepest part of themselves, their history, their culture, the profound and simple beauty of their everyday lives, could not be contained by mortar and stone. And so, in the profound quiet that followed the evening curfew, when the city outside fell into an uneasy, breathless silence, a secret, gentle rebellion began. It was not fought with loud shouts or heavy iron. It was fought with the delicate dipping of a nib into a small glass bottle of ink. There was a man, a historian with incredibly kind eyes and a calm, steady voice, who understood a fundamental truth: to be forgotten is the only true disappearance. His name was Emmanuel, and he began to quietly gather a secret society of observers. They called themselves the Joy of the Sabbath, a beautiful name that spoke of peace in a time of profound unrest. They met in hidden rooms on Saturday afternoons, when the week's heaviest burdens were briefly, gently set aside. But the people who sat around these small wooden tables were not trained soldiers or strategists. They were rabbis with silver in their beards, exhausted doctors with weary hands, young poets with ink-stained fingertips, and ordinary mothers who had perhaps never written anything more formal than a recipe or a grocery list. Emmanuel looked around the room at these gentle faces and gave them a simple, breathtakingly profound instruction. He asked them to write everything down. He asked them to record the quiet truth of their days. He asked them to tell the future who they were, how they lived, how they loved, and how they endured the closing of their world. And so, the enclosed city slowly transformed into a hidden chorus of silent voices, scratching the evidence of their existence onto any scrap of paper they could find. The act of writing became a sanctuary, a small, private room where the mind could wander freely, entirely unbound by the walls outside. Imagine a young girl, no more than 12 years old, sitting by the flickering light of a single, precious candle that casts long, dancing shadows against the peeling wallpaper of her family's room. She has found the blank back of a discarded ration card. With the dull stub of a pencil, she does not write about the biting cold, nor does she write about the hollow ache in her stomach. Instead, she closes her eyes and writes a poem about a small yellow butterfly she saw fluttering near the brick wall that very morning. She carefully describes the fragile, dusty yellow of its wings, capturing its fleeting, beautiful freedom so perfectly that anyone who reads her words will instantly see that butterfly take flight in their own mind. She folds the little paper card into a tiny square and hides it beneath the floorboards, tucking it away like a secret treasure of hope. In another room, a few streets away, an elderly father sits alone at a wobbly table. The house is completely silent, save for the rhythmic, shallow breathing of his sleeping family huddled under blankets in the corner. His hands shake slightly as he holds his pen, the knuckles swollen with the chill of the room. He is writing a letter to an older son who had left the city before the walls were built, a son he has not seen since the autumn leaves first began to turn. He knows with heartbreaking certainty that this letter cannot be mailed. There are no postmen walking these shadowed streets, no trains to carry paper to the outside world. But he writes anyway, pouring the very essence of his love onto the page. He tells his son about a dream he had the night before. He writes of a warm summer evening from long ago, of sitting together on a wooden porch, listening to the gentle hum of the crickets in the tall grass. He describes the taste of sweet lemonade and the feeling of a cool evening breeze. He writes to leave a piece of his soul behind on the paper, a gentle hand reaching across the impossible distance, whispering, "I am still your father, my boy, and my love for you remains completely untouched by the darkness around us." When he finishes, he blows softly on the ink to dry it, folds the paper, and places it inside his coat pocket, keeping it close to his heart. In this hidden world, even the most mundane things became sacred acts of preservation. A weary baker, his ovens long cold and empty, sits by his window in the moonlight and writes down the exact measurements for his grandmother's honey cake. He describes the precise way the sticky dough should feel against the palm of the hand, the specific, rich golden color it must reach in the heat of the oven. He writes this down not because he has flour or honey to bake with, but because the recipe is a map to a world of joy, a world where sweetness and celebration once existed. He is preserving the memory of his grandmother's warm hands, ensuring that the fragrant, beating heart of his family's history will not simply vanish into the winter air. He writes about the way the house smelled on Friday afternoons, the laughter in the kitchen, the warmth of the fire. Through his words, he is baking the bread again, feeding his own spirit with the memory of a simpler, softer time. Day by day, week by week, these fragile pieces of paper, the poems, the unmailed letters, the recipes, the quiet confessions of private fear, and the bold, stubborn declarations of faith, were gathered together. Slipping through the narrow, winding alleys in the dead of night, young couriers carried these documents hidden beneath their coats. They pressed the papers close to their chests to keep them safe from the damp, freezing fog, their hearts beating rapidly against the folded pages. They moved like quiet ghosts through the shadows, delivering the writings to the secret archivists. In hidden cellars and dusty attics, piles of paper slowly grew into mountains. It was a breathtaking accumulation of evidence, proving that behind the harsh brick walls, a vibrant, complex, and deeply beautiful humanity was still breathing. It was an astonishing act of faith. To sit in a freezing room and write a diary in the dark is to believe, with absolute, unshakable certainty, that one day the sun will rise again, and someone will be there to read it. It is a whisper into the void that says, "We matter." But as the season slowly turned, and the shadow over the city grew heavier and more profound, a quiet realization settled into the hearts of Emmanuel and his friends. They looked at the towering stacks of paper and understood that their own hands might not survive to pass these diaries to the world tomorrow. The physical bodies might fail, the walls might close in entirely, but the words, these precious, fragile words that held the very soul of their people, must endure. They had to be protected. They had to be hidden deeply, safely, away from the sweeping winds of history above. And so began the quietest, most poignant act of preservation you could ever imagine. They were preparing to bury the memory of a city. In the deep, suffocating darkness of a hidden cellar, illuminated only by the faint, trembling glow of a single lantern, the archivists brought out their containers. They had found large, sturdy metal milk cans, the kind that once stood on neighborhood doorsteps holding sweet, fresh cream for morning coffee. Now, these everyday objects were being repurposed for an infinitely heavier, holier task. Beside them sat simple tin boxes, welded tightly at the seams. With profound, heartbreaking reverence, they began to pack the papers inside. They moved slowly, carefully smoothing the creases of the paper. They layered the handwritten diaries, the small, faded photographs of smiling families, the crayon drawings of the children, the saved concert programs, and the delicate poems written on ration cards. They packed them tightly, pressing them down, sealing them against the moisture of the earth, against the rot of time, against the terrible silence of forgetting. When the milk cans were entirely full and the lids were sealed tight, they waited for the deepest, quietest hour of the night. It was the hour when even the wind seemed to hold its breath, when the guards on the walls were lulled by the freezing air. A small group of men and women slipped out of the basements and into the ruined, hidden courtyards. The earth beneath their feet was cold, frozen solid by the bitter winter, but they took up their heavy shovels. The metal bit into the dirt with a soft, rhythmic thud. It was exhausting, agonizing work for bodies already weary and thin from months of hunger, but they dug with a desperate, beautiful strength. They were not digging graves, they were planting seeds. They were ensuring that their voices would outlast the walls. Imagine the feeling of the cold, loose earth on their worn hands as they gently lowered the heavy metal cans into the deep holes. They knelt in the dirt, the knees of their trousers damp and freezing. They reached down and placed their palms flat against the smooth, cold metal lids one last time. There were no loud eulogies spoken into the night air. There were only whispered, trembling blessings, words spoken so softly they barely disturbed the dust settling around them. A father whispered a promise to the letters of his children. A poet whispered a goodbye to his verses. They promised the buried words that they would one day be found. They promised the silent voices inside the cans that they would, eventually, be allowed to speak again to a world bathed in light. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, they pushed the dark earth back over the metal. They patted the ground flat, scattering ash, broken bricks, and debris over the surface so that no passing eye would ever know the ground had been disturbed. They stood up, brushing the dirt from their cold hands, and walked quietly back into the shadows of their rooms, leaving their hearts buried behind them. Beneath their feet, deep in the absolute, protective dark, the milk cans rested. They waited perfectly still, holding within their metal walls the laughter, the tears, the lullabies, and the quiet sorrows of an entire vanished world. The tiny ink drops on those thousands of hidden pages were a quiet, magnificent defiance, a refusal to be erased from the earth. They were sleeping, patiently, knowing that words buried in pure love have a way of eventually finding their way back to the surface. As the long, difficult night stretched on above them, the buried archives simply held their breath, carrying the immortal, whispered promise of a people who said, "We were here. We loved, we dreamed, and we wrote it all down." Feel the heavy, still air of a summer afternoon, where the truth is just a whisper carried on a gentle, agonizing breeze. The seasons turned behind the walls, entirely indifferent to the sorrow trapped within. The bitter, biting frost of winter finally melted away, replaced by the deep, suffocating warmth of a brilliant summer. The sun beat down on the red brick walls and the worn cobblestones, casting sharp, unyielding shadows across the narrow streets. In any other time, this would have been a season of open windows, of children chasing each other through the long, golden evenings, of families seeking the cool shade of the chestnut trees. But in this enclosed world, the summer sun brought only a heavy, breathless stillness, a profound waiting for something no one could quite name. And then, the wind shifted, and a new word began to drift through the quiet courtyards and the crowded rooms. It was a soft, deceptive word, wrapped in the illusion of a new beginning. The word was resettlement. Brightly colored posters appeared on the walls overnight, fluttering slightly in the warm air. They spoke of a journey to the east, of wide open spaces, of farms and fields and honest work beneath an open sky. But more than anything, the posters spoke to the deepest, most desperate ache within the city. They promised provisions for anyone who volunteered to go. They promised a heavy loaf of dark bread and a small jar of sweet, sticky marmalade. To a mind that is well-fed, a jar of marmalade is simply a topping for breakfast. But to a mother who has spent a long, agonizing winter dividing crumbs to keep her children breathing, a jar of marmalade is a miracle. It is a beacon of light in an endless night. Imagine her standing before that poster, her thin hand resting against the warm brick. She closes her eyes, and she can almost smell the sweet, bright scent of the fruit. She imagines the feeling of spreading it on a thick slice of bread, handing it to her pale, quiet child, and watching the color finally return to their cheeks. This was the beautiful, heartbreaking illusion they clung to. It was a protective blanket they wrapped around their weary minds, a necessary dream constructed to shield their hearts from the terrifying unknown. They had to believe in the East. They had to believe in the fields, the trees, and the promise of a place where they could simply exist. because the alternative, the dark, unspoken fear that hovered at the edges of their thoughts, was too heavy to carry. And so, the quiet, solemn act of packing began once again. But this time, it was different. There were no heavy wooden trunks, no large leather suitcases. They were told they could only bring a small bundle, just what they could easily carry in their hands for a long journey. Inside the stifling, sun-baked rooms, families gathered their remaining fragments of life. A father stands before a small, cracked mirror. He is brushing the dust from his best wool suit, a suit entirely unsuited for the sweltering heat of the summer day. He meticulously adjusts his collar and smooths his tie. His hands are trembling, but his face is set in a mask of calm determination. He dresses this way not out of vanity, but out of a profound, enduring dignity. He is a gentleman, a man of education and grace, and he is determined to present himself to the world exactly as he is. He wants his children to look at him and feel safe, to believe that a man dressed with such care must surely be leading them toward a respectable future. Across the room, a mother is gently brushing her young daughter's hair. The child is restless in the heat, but the mother's touch is soothing, a rhythmic, hypnotic stroke of the brush. She gathers the fine, dark hair and ties it with a slightly faded, but perfectly pressed, red ribbon. She packs a small cloth bag. Inside, she places a single clean shirt, a wooden comb, a small tin cup, and a favorite, worn rag doll. And deep in the center of the bundle, wrapped in a linen handkerchief, she places a single, faded photograph of their family taken in a park many summers ago, when the world was still soft and open. It is a paper anchor, a reminder of who they were before the shadows fell. When it was time to leave their rooms and step out into the blinding sunlight, there was no loud weeping. There was only the quiet, shuffling sound of thousands of footsteps moving in the same direction. They walked together, shoulder to shoulder, a slow, mournful river of humanity flowing toward the northern edge of the enclosed city. They were walking toward the Umschlagplatz, the gathering square beside the railway tracks. The journey through the streets was a tapestry of tender, desperate connection. Husbands and wives walked with their arms tightly linked, their fingers intertwined so fiercely that their knuckles turned white. They did not need to speak, the pressure of their hands said everything. It said, "I am here. I will not let go. Whatever happens at the end of this road, we will meet it together." When a young child's legs grew tired, an older brother would silently kneel, offering his back, carrying the little one through the thick dust of the street. Neighbors who had shared a single potato in the deep winter now shared the heavy burden of their bundles, passing bags back and forth to give each other a moment of rest. Even in this terrible, forced march, the quiet, breathtaking beauty of their compassion never faded. The gathering square was a vast, unforgiving expanse of concrete and dust, baking beneath the relentless summer sun. There was no shade, no water, no shelter from the heat. Thousands of people sat on their small bundles, a sea of weary souls waiting for the trains to arrive. Yet, even here, in this purgatory of waiting, the human spirit found ways to soften the harsh edges of reality. Imagine a young couple, barely out of their teenage years, sitting close together on the dusty ground. The boy has an old, creased map spread across his knees. He traces a line with his finger, pointing eastward, moving past the city, past the forests, toward a blank space on the paper. He speaks in a low, gentle whisper to his young bride. He describes a small cottage with a thatched roof. He describes a garden where they will grow tall sunflowers and bright green peas. He weaves a story so vivid, so full of hope and sunlight, that the girl rests her head on his shoulder, closes her eyes, and smiles. For a few precious hours, sitting on the burning concrete, she is not a prisoner waiting for a train, she is a young wife dreaming of her future home. Nearby, an elderly man, a former violinist who had to leave his instrument behind, sits with his eyes closed. He gently taps his fingers against his knee. He is playing a symphony in his mind, feeling the swell of the invisible strings, the deep resonance of the cellos. He hums the melody softly, a fragile, trembling sound that carries just far enough to reach the ears of a frightened child sitting next to him. The child stops crying, mesmerized by the quiet music, lulled into a moment of peace by a stranger's beautiful, invisible gift. As the afternoon stretched into evening, painting the sky in colors of bruised purple and fiery orange, the ground began to vibrate. The low, rhythmic chugging of a steam engine echoed through the square. The trains had arrived. The wooden boxcars loomed large and dark against the fading light. The doors were pushed open, revealing the cavernous, shadowy interiors. And then, the final, most heart-wrenching movement began. The boarding was not a chaotic rush, but a slow, heavy stepping up into the unknown. It was here that the true weight of their love was shown. The wooden steps leading up to the boxcars were steep and difficult to climb. Watch as a young man turns back, reaching out both hands to grasp the forearms of an elderly woman he has never met, pulling her gently up into the car. Watch as a mother lifts her child high into the air, passing him into the waiting arms of her husband inside, before turning back to help her own frail mother make the climb. They were leaving everything behind, their homes, their history, the very streets they had walked their entire lives. But they refused to leave their humanity on the platform. They carried their kindness into the wooden cars with them, wrapping it around each other in the suffocating heat. Inside the boxcars, the air was thick with the smell of pine resin and the anxious breath of dozens of people pressed tightly together. The light from the open doorway grew narrow. In those final moments before the heavy doors slid shut, they clung to each other, and they clung to the illusion. They whispered words of comfort into the dark. "It is just a journey," a father murmured, stroking his son's hair. "Soon, we will see the trees. Soon, we will breathe the fresh air of the country." They repeated the promises of the posters, holding the imagined taste of sweet marmalade on their tongues to chase away the bitter taste of fear. They needed to believe that this train was taking them somewhere, anywhere, where they could simply rest. They needed to believe that the world had not completely abandoned them. And then, with a heavy, final thud, the wooden doors were closed. The iron latch fell into place. The sliver of evening light was entirely extinguished, leaving them in profound darkness. The whistle blew, a sharp, mournful cry that pierced the summer night. The metal wheels groaned against the tracks, and the train began to slowly pull away from the square. Left behind was the empty, dusty expanse of the Umschlagplatz. The wind blew a stray, faded red ribbon across the concrete. The square was entirely silent, but if you listened closely, you could almost hear the echoes of their final, gentle words. You could feel the immense, towering weight of the love they had carried with them into the dark. They journeyed into the night, holding tightly to the hands of those they cherished, sustained by a beautiful, fragile dream of the East, riding a train that was taking them far away from the sun, deep into a silence from which they would never return. Listen, if you will, to the soft, rhythmic patter of 200 pairs of small, worn shoes stepping perfectly together onto the sun-warmed cobblestones. Deep within the maze of the walled city, amidst the towering shadows and the quiet despair, there was an island of improbable, beautiful light. It was a house that did not smell of fear, but of scrubbed wooden floors, thin but warm potato soup, and the pages of well-loved fairy tales. This was the domain of a man they simply called the Old Doctor. He was a quiet man with weary, kind eyes that looked through round spectacles, a man who possessed a heart so vast it could hold the sorrows and the dreams of every child who had lost their way in the dark. To the outside world, this building was merely an orphanage. But to the children who lived within its walls, it was a kingdom. The doctor believed, with every fiber of his being, that a child's soul was the most sacred thing on this earth. He did not treat them as castaways or burdens, he treated them as young princes and princesses, as explorers, poets, and dreamers. He built a fortress around them, not made of the harsh red bricks that enclosed the city, but constructed entirely of routine, respect, and unwavering affection. Even as the winter had frozen the water in the wash basins, and even as the summer heat baked the dust in the courtyards, the doctor kept the rhythm of their lives steady and calm. Every morning, beds were carefully made, blankets smoothed flat by small, diligent hands. There were chores to be done, psalms to be sung, and quiet moments set aside for drawing and reading. He created a beautiful, fragile bubble of normalcy, a sanctuary where a child could still simply be a child. In the evenings, when the city outside grew unnervingly quiet, he would sit in the center of the dormitory. The children would gather around his knees, wrapped in their thin blankets, their eyes wide and trusting. He would spin magnificent tales of magical lands, of brave little kings, and of distant, emerald-green forests where the air was always sweet. His voice was a deep, soothing rumble, a lullaby that chased away the nightmares of the waking world. But there came a morning, beneath the heavy, suffocating heat of an August sun, when the shadows finally reached the door of the orphanage. The order was given. The whispers that had haunted the streets had materialized into a terrible reality. They were to be relocated. They were to be sent to the trains. The doctor knew what the trains meant. He was a man of the world, a brilliant physician and writer, and he held no illusions about the darkness that awaited them at the end of the iron tracks. Because he was so revered, because his name carried weight even among those who had built the walls, a quiet door was left open just for him. He was offered a piece of paper, a way out, a chance to walk away from the orphanage and save his own life. But a father does not abandon his children in the dark. He looked at the piece of paper, and then he looked at the 200 sleeping faces in the dormitory, and the choice was no choice at all. He folded the paper, put it away, and began to prepare his children for the morning. He did not wake them with tears. He did not allow a single note of panic to enter his voice. Instead, he moved through the rows of small beds with a gentle, reassuring smile. He woke them softly, whispering that today was a special day. He told them they were going on a grand journey, a field trip to the countryside. He spoke of wide, open meadows where they could run, of tall trees offering cool shade, and of birds that sang without fear. He wove a story so vivid, so entirely convincing, that the children's eyes lit up with the brilliant, unblemished spark of anticipation. "Put on your very best clothes, my darlings," he told them softly. "We must look our best for such an important journey." And so, the morning was spent in quiet, deliberate preparation. Older girls helped the younger ones tie the ribbons in their hair, their fingers moving with practiced, tender care. Little boys scrubbed their faces until their cheeks were pink, carefully buttoning their best, slightly frayed shirts. The doctor walked among them, straightening a collar here, tucking in a shirt there, his hands moving with the reverent grace of a tailor-fitting royalty for a grand procession. He told them to pack their most precious belongings. A young boy tucked his favorite wooden blocks into his pocket. A little girl clutched a worn rag doll tightly to her chest, its button eyes staring blankly ahead. They packed not for survival, but for comfort, carrying the tiny anchors of their childhood with them. When it was time to leave, they did not stumble out into the street in fear. They assembled in the courtyard, lining up perfectly, 2 by 2. It was not a chaotic herd driven by the harsh shouts of guards, it was a magnificent, heartbreaking parade of dignity. At the very front of the line, a young boy held a large, green flag high in the air. It was the banner of King Mat I, a brave child king from one of the doctor's own beloved stories. The flag rippled gently in the hot, still air, a vibrant splash of color against the gray and red of the walled city. It was a symbol of their kingdom, a quiet declaration that they were not victims, but travelers embarking on a royal journey. The wooden doors of the courtyard opened, and they stepped out into the blinding sunlight of the street. The doctor walked at the very front, his head held high, his steps slow and measured. He wore his worn, dark green coat, despite the suffocating heat, presenting himself with the formal, quiet pride of a patriarch leading his family. In his left hand, he held the small, trusting hand of a 5-year-old girl. She looked up at him constantly, her tiny fingers wrapped tightly around his thumb. In his right arm, he carried a little boy who had grown too tired to walk, the child's head resting peacefully against the doctor's shoulder. As the procession moved down the cobblestone streets, a profound, heavy silence fell over the city. The people who lived behind the walls stopped whatever they were doing. The weary bakers, the hidden diarists, the mothers dividing their bread, they all came to the windows and stood on the sidewalks. They watched this impossible sight. They watched 200 children, dressed in their Sunday best, walking with perfect, unwavering trust behind an old man with kind eyes. No one shouted. No one cried out. The sight was too holy, too deeply heartbreaking for noise. The onlookers wept silently, tears tracing paths through the dust on their cheeks. They were witnessing the very best of humanity walking quietly toward the very worst. The doctor did not look left or right. He kept his eyes focused ahead, occasionally looking down to smile at the little girl holding his hand. "Keep your heads high, my brave explorers," he would whisper, his voice a steady, comforting hum beneath the sound of their marching feet. "We are almost to the train. Think of the beautiful green fields waiting for us." He was their shield. With every step, with every gentle squeeze of a small hand, he was absorbing their fear, taking it entirely upon himself so that they would not have to carry it. He was performing the ultimate act of love, constructing an impenetrable fortress of peace around their minds, even as the physical world closed in around them. The journey was long, and the heat radiating from the stones was intense. When a child stumbled, an older sibling would reach out to steady them. When a little one grew frightened by the harsh, barked orders of the guards lining the streets, the doctor would simply hum a familiar lullaby, the melody floating back through the ranks, smoothing the anxious ripples. He was the center of their universe, and as long as he was there, walking tall and calm, they believed with absolute certainty that they were safe. Finally, they reached the vast, dusty expanse of the Umschlagplatz. The air here was different, thick with dust, the smell of hot iron, and the overwhelming presence of the dark, wooden boxcars waiting on the tracks. The noise of the steam engines and the slamming of heavy doors was frightening. The children huddled closer together, their eyes wide, looking up at the doctor for reassurance. He knelt down in the dirt, regardless of his dark coat. He brought himself down to their eye level, placing his hands gently on their small shoulders. He looked into their faces, and he smiled. It was not a fragile smile, or a smile forced through terror. It was a smile of absolute, uncompromising love. It was a smile that said, "I am with you. I will never leave you." "Here is our carriage," he said softly, pointing to the dark opening of the boxcar. "It looks a little dark, but it is just a train to take us to the sunshine. We must be brave, and we must stay together." He stood by the wooden steps of the car, and one by one, he helped them up. He lifted the smaller children beneath their arms, hoisting them gently into the shadows. As he lifted them, he murmured the final words of the fairy tale he had started that morning. He promised them a kingdom where no one was ever hungry, where the cold winter winds never blew, and where children could play in the tall grass until the stars came out. He lifted the boy with the wooden blocks. He lifted the girl with the rag doll. He touched their cheeks, he smoothed their hair, wrapping them in his love one last time. And then, when every last child was safely inside, the old doctor grasped the wooden frame of the door. He pulled himself up into the dark boxcar to join them. He did not look back at the city. He did not look back at the life he was leaving behind. He only looked at his children, gathering them close to his coat in the dim light. The heavy wooden doors slid shut with a terrible, final sound. The iron latch fell. The train blew its mournful whistle and began to roll slowly away from the platform, carrying the children and their king into the deep quiet of the unknown. We do not think of the darkness of that journey. Instead, we close our eyes and remember the brilliant, unyielding light of a man who held a small hand in his own, who walked with perfect grace through the dust, and who proved that even in the absolute depths of human cruelty, love can still choose to walk beside the innocent, whispering stories of the sun. Feel the profound, heavy stillness of a city that has suddenly lost its voice, waiting in the freezing dark for a morning that will not come. When winter returned to the walled streets, it found a world entirely transformed. The snow began to fall just as it always had, drifting down from a pale, indifferent sky, coating the rooftops and the window ledges in a thick, soft blanket of white. But as the flakes settled on the cobblestones, they covered an emptiness that was deeply, heartbreakingly new. The narrow streets, once overflowing with the chaotic, vibrant hum of 100,000 lives, were now vast and hollow. There were far fewer footsteps in the fresh snow this year. The laughter that used to echo from the hidden courtyards was gone. The grand, agonizing procession of the summer had taken so many away, leaving behind a silence that was not peaceful, but heavy with the weight of absence. For a long time, the remaining few had wrapped themselves in the fragile, desperately needed illusion of the East. They had clung to the whispered promises of open fields and resettlement, holding onto the memory of a jar of sweet marmalade and a loaf of bread. It was a beautiful dream, a necessary shield that had allowed them to endure the heartbreak of watching the trains pull away. But as the winter deepened, the biting wind began to carry a different kind of whisper. It did not happen all at once. The truth arrived in fragments, carried by a brave, exhausted few who had somehow slipped away from the end of the tracks and walked for weeks through the freezing forests to return to the walls. They slipped back into the shadows of the city like ghosts, their faces hollow, their voices barely above a trembling breath. They sat by cold, unlit stoves in dark rooms, and they spoke the unspeakable. There were no farms. There were no open fields. The journey was not a beginning, but an end. Imagine the quiet, shattering moment when a heart finally lets go of its last, desperate hope. It is not accompanied by a loud cry or a dramatic tearing of clothes. It is much softer, much more devastating than that. A father sits by a frosted window, looking out at the falling snow. He had kissed his wife and young daughter goodbye at the square just a few months ago, promising them he would follow soon. He had spent every day since imagining them in a small cottage, picturing his daughter learning to plant seeds in the dark earth. Now, the whisper reaches him. He sits perfectly still. He does not weep. He simply closes his eyes, and you can see a profound, unimaginable shift wash over his weary face. The gentle, constructed world in his mind quietly crumbles into ash. He breathes in the freezing air, and he accepts the impossible truth. The illusion is gone, leaving only the stark, cold reality of the brick walls around him. But in the wake of this shattered hope, something truly remarkable began to happen. When the terrifying anxiety of the unknown is finally stripped away, it is often replaced by a strange, profound clarity. The frantic, desperate energy of trying to survive, of trying to guess the rules of an impossible game, slowly began to fade. In its place, a deep, solemn calm settled over the survivors. It was the winter of the awakened. They realized that if the end was inevitable, then the only thing left to control was how they would meet it. Nowhere was this beautiful, tragic shift more evident than among the youth. The young men and women who remained had aged a lifetime in a single season. They were the dreamers who, just a few springs ago, had sat in sunlit cafes arguing about poetry and philosophy, their fingers stained with ink, their hearts full of reckless, beautiful tomorrows. Now, they were the elders of a vanished world. They walked through the snowy streets with a new posture. Their heads were no longer bowed against the wind. They moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, their eyes clear and wide open to the dark. As the nights grew painfully long and the cold seeped deep into the bones of the buildings, these young people began to gather. They did not meet in the open squares or the daylight. They descended beneath the frozen earth. Follow them down the narrow, stone steps into the deep cellars beneath the ruined apartment blocks. The air down here is bitterly cold, so cold that every breath blooms into a fragile, white mist in the dim light. The walls are damp brick and rough stone. In the center of the small room, a single, precious candle burns, its tiny golden flame casting long, dancing shadows that stretch across the faces of those gathered in the circle. Look at their faces in the candlelight. They are so young, yet their eyes hold the profound, ancient sorrow of the stars. They sit closely together on overturned wooden crates and dusty floors, sharing the warmth of their bodies. A young man hands a small, chipped tin cup of hot water to the girl beside him. She takes it with both hands, wrapping her numb fingers around the warm metal, and offers him a soft, deeply grateful smile. It is a moment of pure, tender humanity in a world that has tried to strip all humanity away. They do not shout. They do not raise their voices in anger or beat their fists against the stone. Their conversation is a gentle, flowing stream of whispers, respectful of the silence, respectful of the gravity of their choice. They are sharing a profound, collective realization: they will not walk quietly to the square when the trains return. They make a vow to one another, not a vow born of hatred, but a vow born of an absolute, unbreakable love for the people they have lost. They promise each other that they will write their own final chapter. In the corner of the cellar, slightly away from the center of the candlelight, a young woman sits with a small, worn notebook resting on her knees. Her name is Sarah. Before the walls were built, she played the piano, her fingers dancing across ivory keys with the joyous, unburdened lightness of a summer breeze. Now, her hands are wrapped in ragged wool, her fingertips bruised by the cold. She holds a small stub of a pencil. She is not writing a manifesto. She is writing a letter she knows will never, ever find a mailbox. She writes to her mother, who was taken on the trains in the heat of August. The scratching of her pencil is a soft, rhythmic heartbeat in the quiet room. She writes about the snow falling outside. She writes about the friends sitting around her. And then, she writes these words: "Do not be afraid for me, my beautiful mother. The fear has finally gone. I am no longer waiting for the dark to take me. I have decided to light a match. We will not be led away. We will stand here, in the home we loved, and we will let the world know that we were entirely, beautifully human until the very last breath." She folds the piece of paper with agonizing care, smoothing the creases with her thumb, and tucks it gently into the pocket of her coat. It is her quiet declaration of independence, a deeply personal reclamation of her own soul. Around the candle, the hushed voices continue to weave a tapestry of solemn resolve. Two young men, lifelong friends who once chased each other through the sunlit schoolyards, sit shoulder to shoulder. One rests his weary head gently against the shoulder of the other. They do not need to speak to understand the weight of the promise they are making. They are simply drawing strength from the physical presence of one another. They are finding a profound, transcendent peace in the absolute certainty that whatever happens next, they will face it exactly like this, together, side by side, unbroken in spirit. They begin to trade their most prized, hidden possessions: a silver watch, a gold wedding band saved from a grandmother, a beloved book of verses, not for bread, but for small, smuggled pieces of iron. They wrap these small weapons in soft cloth with the same gentle reverence one might use to swaddle a newborn child. They are not monsters of war. They are gentle children of peace, forced by an unimaginable cruelty to build a fortress out of their own fragile bodies. This transformation is not a hardening of their hearts, it is a profound deepening of their love. They love their history, they love their vanished families, and they love each other too much to simply fade into the ashes of history without leaving a spark. When the gathering finally comes to an end, they extinguish the single candle. The cellar is plunged back into absolute, pitch-black darkness. But the air does not feel heavy anymore. It feels charged with a quiet, breathtaking majesty. They walk softly back up the stone steps, emerging one by one into the freezing night air. The city above is entirely asleep, buried under the deep, quiet snow. They pull their thin coats tighter around their shoulders and walk back to their hidden, drafty rooms. As they lie down on their hard beds, pulling the thin blankets up to their chins, their minds are finally quiet. The agonizing, sleepless nights spent wondering about the East are over. The terror of the unknown has vanished. In its place is the profound, beautiful peace of a soul that has finally anchored itself in the storm. They have made their choice. They have taken back the pen. Listen to the steady, calm rhythm of their breathing as they sleep. It is the sound of an awakened spirit, resting in the deep, quiet dignity of knowing exactly who they are. They are no longer waiting for the end. They are simply waiting for the morning, ready to stand together in the snow, a beautiful, heartbreaking testament to the enduring, unwavering light of the human heart. Imagine the sound of a single, sudden heartbeat in a world that had almost forgotten how to feel alive. There was a morning deep in the heart of winter when the sky over the city was the color of bruised pearl, a soft, heavy gray that seemed to press down upon the snow-dusted rooftops. The air was bitterly cold, so crisp and still that every breath hung in the air like a tiny, fragile ghost before slowly dissolving into the frost. On this morning, the familiar, dreadful rhythm of the walled city began to play out once more. The heavy, rhythmic thud of boots echoed against the brickwork. The quiet, exhausted shuffling of footsteps filled the narrow streets. The remaining people were being gathered again, asked to line up, asked to begin that slow, mournful walk toward the square and the tracks. It felt, to anyone watching from the frosted windows above, like the beginning of another tragic, inevitable verse in a song of endless sorrow. The people walked with their heads bowed against the biting wind, pulling their thin, ragged coats tightly around their fragile shoulders. They looked like shadows moving through a world entirely drained of color. But if you looked very closely at the line of people walking through the snow, you would notice something imperceptibly different. You would see it not in the grand sweep of the crowd, but in the subtle posture of a few. Among the weary walkers was a young woman. Let us call her Miriam. She was no older than 20, though the deep, sorrowful wisdom in her eyes made her look as though she had lived 1,000 years. She walked with her hands thrust deep into the pockets of her worn woolen coat. To the guard standing on the corners, she was merely another silent shadow, another compliant ghost moving gently toward the dark. But inside her right pocket, Miriam's hand was not empty. Her fingers, numb with the cold, were wrapped tightly around a small, heavy piece of iron. It was a pistol, smuggled through the walls at unimaginable risk, traded for the last of a family's hidden bread. As she walked, she did not think of violence. She thought of her mother's hands, the way they used to smell of fresh flour and rosemary on a Friday afternoon. She thought of her little brother's laugh, a bright, clear sound that used to bounce around the walls of their sunny apartment. She held the cold metal in her pocket, and as the warmth of her own hand slowly transferred to the iron, it felt less like a weapon and more like a bridge. It felt like a profound, heavy anchor tying her to the memory of everyone she had loved and lost. She was carrying their dignity in the palm of her hand. Her heart was beating with a terrifying, magnificent speed. It was a sensation she had not felt in months. For so long, her heart had only ached, a slow, hollow thud of enduring grief. But now, it was racing like a wild bird trapped against her ribs. It was the intoxicating, breathtaking feeling of agency. It was the feeling of knowing that the next page of the story was no longer written by someone else. A few steps behind her walked a young man named David. His eyes were fixed on the back of Miriam's coat. They had known each other since they were children, back when their biggest worry was whether the winter ice on the pond was thick enough for skating. He, too, had his hands deep in his pockets. He, too, felt the wild, drumming rhythm of a racing heart. As the line approached a familiar intersection, a place where the cobblestones were entirely masked by the packed white snow, the moment arrived. It was not announced by a grand trumpet or a dramatic shout. It began with a simple, quiet exchange of glances. Miriam turned her head just slightly over her shoulder. Her eyes met David's. In that fraction of a second, an entire universe of unspoken love, terror, and ultimate bravery passed between them. They offered each other a nearly imperceptible nod. It was a promise, sealed in the freezing air. When the order was shouted to turn down the street leading toward the square, the line dutifully began to bend. But Miriam did not turn. She stopped walking. She planted her worn boots firmly into the snow. Beside her, David stopped. Around them, a dozen other young men and women, the dreamers of the hidden cellars, the poets of the buried archives, simply stopped moving. Imagine the sheer, stunning silence of that single second. It was as if the earth itself had forgotten how to spin. The guards turned, their faces slack with absolute bewilderment. They were accustomed to complete surrender. They had been trained to manage fear, to herd compliance. They had never, in all their time behind the walls, been faced with a shadow that refused to move. And then, the spark was struck. It was a sudden, chaotic flurry of movement, completely shattering the gray stillness of the morning. Hands pulled free from pockets. A sharp, echoing crack split the freezing air, then another. It was entirely disorienting, a sudden reversal of the fundamental laws of their enclosed universe. The young people did not charge forward in a wave of military precision. They moved with the desperate, beautiful agility of youth who knew every hidden courtyard, every ruined cellar, and every narrow alleyway of their walled world. They struck their spark, and then they scattered, melting back into the brickwork, diving through broken doorways, disappearing into the shadows before the stunned guards could even fully comprehend that the script had been torn to pieces. Follow Miriam as she slips into a dark, narrow passageway between two leaning buildings. She runs until her lungs burn with the icy air, until she finds the hidden entrance to a subterranean basement. She practically falls down the stone steps, slipping into the pitch-black safety of the underground room. She leans her back against the rough, damp stone wall and slowly slides down until she is sitting on the cold dirt floor. The silence of the cellar wraps around her like a heavy blanket. She is gasping for breath, pulling the cold air into her lungs. She brings her trembling hands up to her face. They are shaking so violently she can barely interlock her fingers. But she is not crying from fear. She closes her eyes, and a single, hot tear escapes, tracking a clean line through the dust on her cheek. It is a tear of profound, overwhelming relief. It is the physical manifestation of a soul returning to its body. She sits in the dark, feeling the rough stone against her spine, and she whispers a single, breathtaking realization to herself in the quiet room. We said no. It was such a small word. Just a breath, really. But in a world where every single force was designed to render them entirely voiceless, saying no was a miracle. It was a sudden, glorious beam of sunlight breaking through a year of absolute midnight. She had not saved the city. She knew the walls were still there. She knew the winter would still be cold. But in that brief, brilliant moment on the cobblestones, she had reclaimed her own humanity. She had proved that her spirit was entirely, beautifully unbroken. Above ground, the news of the morning did not travel through the streets. It drifted through the buildings like a warm, gentle breeze. It was passed in hushed whispers from window to window, from neighbor to neighbor. In a cramped room on the 4th floor, an elderly watchmaker who had not spoken more than a few words in weeks looked up from his empty table. A neighbor leaned in through the doorway, his eyes wide, and whispered what he had seen at the intersection. The old man listened, his cloudy eyes widening. He slowly lifted his trembling, wrinkled hand and pressed it gently against his chest, right over his heart. A faint, deeply peaceful smile touched the corners of his mouth. He felt a sudden, strange warmth in the freezing room. He realized that the children, the beautiful, brave children of their city, were standing up. They were lighting candles in the wind. That evening, as the deep purple twilight settled over the snow-covered rooftops, the city felt fundamentally different. The fear was still there, hovering at the edges of the room, but it was no longer the only thing in the air. Down in the hidden cellars, the youth gathered again. The single candle was lit. But tonight, the faces in the golden light were entirely transformed. They were exhausted, their clothes damp from the snow, their faces pale, but their eyes held a stunning, radiant clarity. David sat beside Miriam. He reached out and gently took her cold hand in his, holding it quietly, a gesture of profound respect and enduring friendship. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small piece of folded paper and a pencil. He did not write of the terror of the morning. He wrote a letter to his older sister, who had been forced onto the trains during the heat of the summer. He knew she would never read it, but he needed the universe to hold his words. He leaned close to the flickering candle, his handwriting small and neat. "My dearest sister," he wrote, "I wish you could have seen the snow today. It was so white, so perfectly clean. Today, we did not walk with our heads looking down at our shoes. Today, we looked up. I felt you standing beside me on the street. I felt your hand on my shoulder. We are still here, my beautiful sister. The dark has not swallowed us yet. Today, we remembered how to be brave. We remembered how to be free." He carefully folded the paper and tucked it into his pocket, keeping it close to his newly awakened heart. The spark on the cobblestones had only lasted for a few moments, but its light was now burning steadily inside them. It was not a fire that would consume the world, but a gentle, steady flame that would keep their souls warm through whatever night was to come. They leaned their heads against one another, finding comfort in the simple, miraculous sound of each other's breathing. They closed their eyes and let sleep finally take them, not as prisoners waiting for an inevitable end, but as quiet heroes who had suddenly, beautifully realized the immense, towering power of their own fragile lives. They slept in the dark, wrapped in a new, quiet dignity, entirely ready for the dawn. Imagine the scent of spring trying to slip through the cracks of a world entirely buried in shadow. Above the ground, the great wheel of the seasons was turning once more. The bitter, freezing winds of winter had finally exhausted themselves, giving way to the softer, damp breezes of April. Somewhere, far beyond the brick walls and the watchtowers, the ice was melting into clear streams, and the chestnut trees were daring to push tiny, pale green buds into the warming air. But here, within the enclosed city, the arrival of spring was not marked by the blossoming of flowers. It was marked by a retreat deeper into the earth. The people had moved below the cobblestones, seeking the quiet sanctuary of subterranean basements and hidden bunkers. Yet, even in the stifling, damp dark of the underground, they knew exactly what time of year it was. The calendar of their ancestors was carved deeply into their hearts, a map of time that no wall could ever block. It was the eve of Passover, the ancient festival of spring, the holy night when they were commanded to remember the journey from slavery to freedom. To speak of freedom while sitting in a locked cage beneath the earth seems like an impossible, heartbreaking paradox. But to the people gathered in the dim light of those cellars, it was not a paradox at all. It was an absolute, breathtaking necessity. They knew that true freedom is not always measured by the open sky above your head. Sometimes, it is measured by the quiet, unbreakable architecture of your own soul. Follow the soft, flickering light down the narrow stone steps, deep into the belly of the ruined city. The air here is thick, smelling of damp earth and the anxious breath of dozens of families sharing the same cramped space. But tonight, a profound, hushed reverence has settled over the bunker. They are preparing to set the table. There are no grand dining rooms here, no mahogany tables or fine china. A family gathers around a simple wooden packing crate, entirely transformed by a single, fragile act of dignity. The mother of the family steps forward. In her hands, she holds a piece of white cloth. It is not perfect, it is frayed at the edges and slightly yellowed with age, but she has guarded it fiercely through all the relocations and all the sorrow. With slow, deliberate grace, she drapes the cloth over the rough wood, smoothing the wrinkles with the palms of her worn hands. In that gentle motion, the wooden crate ceases to be a box in a cellar. It becomes an altar. It becomes a home. She does not have her silver candlesticks. They were traded long ago for a handful of flour. Instead, she has two small hollows carved into a raw potato, filled with a few precious drops of oil and a makeshift wick of twisted string. She strikes a match, the tiny flare of yellow catching the dust in the air, and lights the wicks. She circles her hands over the small flames and covers her eyes. Her lips move in a silent, ancient whisper, welcoming the holy festival. When she opens her eyes, the golden light reflects in the tears she refuses to let fall, casting a soft, warm glow on the faces of her children sitting in the shadows. Setting the Seder plate on this night required a heartbreaking, magnificent kind of imagination. The traditions called for a feast, for roasted lamb, for sweet apples mixed with wine, for the fresh greens of spring. They had none of this. But they had the profound, enduring power of memory. In the center of the white cloth, the father places a single, remarkably thin piece of matzah. It had been baked in secret weeks ago, using smuggled flour and water, guarded like a priceless jewel just for this night. It is the bread of affliction, the bread of haste, and tonight, it looks exactly as it must have looked thousands of years ago in the desert. For the bitter herbs, the maror, meant to symbolize the bitterness of slavery, they do not need to search far. A grandfather reaches into his pocket and produces a tiny sliver of a sharp, wild root he managed to pull from the frozen dirt of the courtyard days before. But as he places it on the table, a silent understanding passes between the adults. They do not need the root to taste the bitterness. The bitter herbs are the walls outside. The bitter herbs are the empty chairs where their loved ones used to sit. The bitterness is the very air they are breathing. And for the wine, the symbol of joy and redemption, there are only 4 small tin cups filled with water, perhaps sweetened with a single, hoarded drop of saccharin. Yet, as they look at those tin cups, they choose to see the sweetness of the life they are desperately holding on to. Just as the grandfather clears his throat to begin the prayers, a sound filters down from the ceiling above. It is the rhythmic, heavy thud of leather boots marching across the cobblestones. The city above them is awake, and the guards are moving. The vibration shakes the cellar ever so slightly, causing a fine mist of brick dust to drift down from the ceiling, settling onto the white cloth. The people around the table freeze. A young mother instinctively pulls her child closer to her chest, hiding the little one's face in the rough wool of her coat. The boots walk directly overhead, a terrifying, metallic scraping against the stone. But watch the grandfather. He does not cower. He gently reaches out, brushes the dust from the piece of matzah, and closes his eyes. He does not have a prayer book, all the books were lost in the flames of the previous winter. But he does not need a book. The words are woven into his very being. He begins to sing. His voice is a low, soothing hum, scarcely louder than a whisper, perfectly calibrated so it will not carry beyond the thick cellar walls. It is a beautiful, mournful melody, carrying the weight of centuries of survival. As the boots march above, dictating a world of absolute tyranny, the grandfather's gentle voice rises below, dictating a world of absolute, unyielding faith. The contrast is staggering. Above them is the machinery of erasure, below them is the quiet, unbreakable poetry of endurance. He nods to the youngest child at the table, a boy of no more than 7, with wide, dark eyes that have seen far too much of the dark. It is time for the Manishtana, the 4 questions. Why is this night different from all other nights? The little boy whispers, his voice trembling just a little in the damp air. It is the most poignant question ever asked in the history of the world. Why is this night different? Every night in the cellar is cold. Every night is shrouded in hunger and fear. But the father looks at his son, his eyes overflowing with an immense, protective love, and he answers softly. Because tonight, my beautiful boy, we remember that we are not slaves to the darkness. We remember that we belong to the light. The father tells the story of the Exodus. He speaks of Pharaoh, of the heavy bricks, of the cracking whips, and of the miraculous journey through the parted sea. He tells it not as a dusty history lesson, but as a living, breathing promise. He is weaving a shield of words around his family, reminding them that empires of cruelty have risen before, and empires of cruelty have fallen, but the gentle, enduring spirit of their people has always survived to see the morning. As the Seder progresses, they reach the moment where tradition dictates they open the door to welcome Elijah the prophet, the herald of peace and redemption. In a normal year, a child would run to the front door, throwing it wide open to the spring breeze. Here, in the bunker, opening the heavy wooden door means certain discovery. It means death. So, they perform a breathtaking act of spiritual defiance. They do not open the physical door. Instead, they close their eyes, and they open the doors of their hearts. The mother looks at the empty space at the corner of the crate. She has set a tiny tin cup there, filled with a thimble of water. It is meant for Elijah, but as she stares at it, she imagines her older son, who was taken on the trains the summer before, sitting in that space. She imagines him walking through the damp stone walls, sitting beside her, resting his head on her shoulder. She smiles, a soft, heartbreaking smile in the candlelight, feeling the warmth of his memories sitting at the table with them. They welcome the prophet, they welcome the ghosts of their beloveds, inviting them into the fragile sanctuary of their love. They break the tiny piece of matzah. The father carefully hands a crumb to his wife, to his father, to his children. It is dry and tasteless, but as it touches their tongues, it is the most magnificent feast they have ever shared. It is a communion of sorrow, a shared vow that as long as they have a single crumb to divide, they will divide it together. They will not let the cruelty above ground turn them into animals below it. They are sharing the very essence of their humanity. In the corner of the cellar, slightly apart from the family, sits a young man with a stub of a pencil and a crumpled piece of paper. He holds it close to the candle flame, recording the scene. He listens to the soft Hebrew chanting blending with the terrifying thud of the boots above. He writes to the future, entirely unsure if the future will ever find his words. He writes, "Tonight, the world above belongs to the soldiers. But the world below, the world of the soul, belongs entirely to us. They can lock us in the dark, but they cannot stop us from lighting the candles. They can take away our bread, but they cannot take away our prayers. Tonight, we are free." As the Seder draws to a close, the tiny oil lamps burning in the hollowed potatoes begin to sputter, the fuel running low. The shadows in the cellar stretch longer, reaching softly across the faces of the families. The grandfather raises his tin cup of water for the final time. "Next year in Jerusalem," he whispers. It is a prayer for a distant, sunlit peace. They do not know if there will be a next week, let alone a next year. They do not know if they will ever feel the warmth of the sun on their faces again. But in this quiet, stolen hour, wrapped in the soothing cadence of ancient words and the physical warmth of each other's presence, they have found an impossible, beautiful peace. The little boy rests his head in his mother's lap, his eyes heavy with sleep. She strokes his hair, humming the last notes of the Passover melody. The boots above have finally marched away, leaving only the profound, protective silence of the earth. The light of the potato lamps gently flickers out, plunging the room into darkness, but the families do not feel cold. They have built a fortress of memory and love, a sanctuary of pure, whispered light that no shadow can ever truly extinguish. They close their eyes and sleep, free people in the dark, waiting with quiet, perfect dignity for whatever the dawn may bring. Listen to the steady, fragile rhythm of a mother's breath in the absolute dark, spinning a thread of gold in a world that is turning to ash. There comes a time when the sky above is no longer a place of light, and the only sanctuary left is deep within the embrace of the earth. As the spring progressed, the city above them began to change its shape. The air grew thick with the heavy, bitter scent of smoke, and the cobblestones grew far too hot to walk upon. The world they had known, the streets where they had traded and loved and dreamed, was being erased by a terrible, sweeping fire. And so, the people did not run outward. They flowed downward. They slipped through hidden trapdoors and ruined kitchens, they crawled through narrow, earthen tunnels dug by desperate, loving hands in the dead of night, and they descended into the quiet, velvet dark of the subterranean bunkers. Imagine leaving the sun behind, knowing you might never feel its warmth on your face again, and yet feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of relief as the heavy wooden floorboards are pulled shut above your head. Down here, beneath the cellars and the sewers, the air was cool and damp. It smelled of wet clay, of old dust, and of the hundreds of terrified, beautiful souls who had come to press their shoulders together in the gloom. They were packed so tightly in these hidden rooms that they became a single, breathing organism. There was no personal space, no separation between the wealthy and the poor, the young and the old. There was only the shared, rhythmic rise and fall of their chests. In the profound darkness, where even a single candle was a dangerous luxury that consumed too much precious oxygen, sight surrendered to touch and sound. This was a world constructed entirely of whispers. It had to be. To speak aloud was to invite the attention of the heavy boots that paced relentlessly on the ruins above. And so, the people learned to communicate in the softest of murmurs. A grandfather would lean his cheek against his grandson's hair, speaking directly into the boy's ear, his voice barely a vibration in the stillness. Neighbors who could not see each other's faces would blindly reach out in the dark, finding a trembling hand, and squeezing it gently. That simple pressure said everything words could not. I am here. You are not alone. We are still breathing. But it was the children who found the darkness the most difficult to bear. They were confused by the sudden night, frightened by the close, stifling air, and terrified by the deep, muffled thuds that occasionally shook the earth around them, causing fine showers of dirt to rain down on their heads. When the ground trembled, the little ones would whimper, their tiny voices threatening to break the absolute, necessary silence of the bunker. It was in these terrifying, trembling moments that the most magnificent, quiet heroism of the entire war revealed itself. It did not carry a weapon. It did not shout defiant slogans. It simply cleared its throat in the dark and began to sing. When a child began to cry, a mother would gather that small, shaking body into her lap. She would wrap her thin arms tightly around her little one, pressing the child's ear directly against her chest so that the frantic beating of the child's heart could match the steady, enduring rhythm of her own. She would bury her face in the child's hair, smelling the dust and the sweet, lingering scent of childhood, and she would begin to hum. The lullaby would start as a sound so soft it was almost indistinguishable from the breathing of the room. It was a melody passed down through generations, born in the sunlit nurseries of a vanished time, now taking root in the damp earth. Slowly, gently, the mother would add words to the tune. She sang the ancient Yiddish songs of raisins and almonds, of little white goats sleeping under the bed, of a future where the roads were safe and the cupboards were full. Her voice was not dramatic or loud. It was a quiet, soothing river of sound, flowing continuously, washing away the jagged edges of the terror. As she sang, the other mothers in the dark room would hear the melody, and they, too, would begin to hum along, pulling their own children closer. Soon, the entire subterranean chamber was filled with a delicate, woven tapestry of women's voices. It was an impossible, breathtaking defiance. Above them, an empire of iron and fire was doing everything in its power to extinguish their existence. But below the ground, in the suffocating dark, these mothers were using the softest, most fragile weapon on earth, a lullaby, to build an impenetrable fortress around the minds of their children. If you closed your eyes and simply listened to the sound in that bunker, you would not know there was a war raging above. You would only hear a nursery. You would only hear love. The mother's song was a promise she could not guarantee, but one she made with every fiber of her being. "Sleep, my little bird," the song whispered. "Close your eyes. The monsters cannot reach you here. I have wrapped you in a blanket of music, and nothing can break through." And miraculously, the children listened. Lulled by the hypnotic, swaying rhythm of their mothers' bodies, and mesmerized by the ancient, comforting melodies, the frantic tension would begin to drain from their small limbs. The whimpers would subside into soft, sleepy sighs. Their eyelids, heavy with exhaustion and dust, would flutter shut. Even as the ceiling above them shuddered and rained down earth, the children slept, perfectly insulated in a bubble of complete and utter devotion. While the children slept, the adults sat entirely awake, keeping their silent vigil in the velvet black. In one corner of the bunker, an older sister, perhaps 14 years old, sits with her knees pulled up to her chest. Her little brother is asleep, his head resting heavily on her lap. She is painfully thirsty, her throat dry and coated with dust. Earlier that day, an old man had passed down a small tin cup containing just a few drops of precious, dirty water. She had not drunk it. She had tipped it carefully past her brother's chapped lips, watching his throat swallow the moisture. Now, she rests her hand gently on his back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. She traces small, invisible circles on his coat with her finger. She is terrified, her own heart hammering against her ribs, but she forces her breathing to remain slow and deep, so her fear will not transmit to the boy. She has become his guardian, her love overriding every natural instinct of her own survival. Nearby, a young father sits with his back pressed against the damp earthen wall. He cannot see his wife, but he can hear the soft, rhythmic sound of her breathing just inches away. He reaches his hand across the cold dirt floor until his fingertips brush against hers. They interlock their fingers. He closes his eyes and, in his mind, he writes a letter to her, a letter he will never be able to speak aloud. My beautiful wife, he thinks, the words forming a silent, protective halo in his mind. I am so sorry for the dark. I am so sorry for the damp earth. But as I sit here holding your hand, I want you to know that there is nowhere else in the universe I would rather be. They can take the sun from us, they can take the streets, and they can take the sky. But they cannot take this moment. They cannot take the way my hand perfectly fits in yours. They think they have buried us, but they do not understand that seeds are planted in the dark. Our love is the seed, my darling. And even if we never see the spring, what we are sharing in this room right now is a victory they can never touch. He squeezes her hand, and in the dark, he feels her gently squeeze back. It is a complete, perfect conversation without a single sound. These quiet, hidden spaces beneath the burning city were not tombs of despair. They were the ultimate, distilled essence of what it means to be human. When everything else is stripped away, when the house is gone, the food is gone, the light is gone, and even the air is running out, what is left? What was left was a grandfather taking off his own thin coat to drape it over the shivering shoulders of a stranger. What was left was a young man silently holding up a weak, crumbling timber of the ceiling with his bare hands so the earth would not fall on the sleeping families below, his muscles shaking with the effort, his face a mask of quiet endurance. What was left was the unbroken, whispered melody of a mother who refused to let her baby know the true cruelty of the world. As the long, agonizing hours crept by, the air in the bunker grew heavier, the oxygen slowly thinning. Breathing became a conscious, labored effort. The shadows seemed to press closer. But the lullabies never entirely stopped. When one mother's voice grew hoarse and faded, another mother in the dark would gently pick up the melody, carrying the tune forward like a fragile, glowing ember passed from hand to hand. They were weaving a continuous blanket of sound, ensuring that if a child were to briefly wake, the very first thing they would hear was not the destruction above, but the soothing, eternal sound of comfort below. Think of the profound, towering majesty of that choice. To sit in the suffocating dark, knowing the end of the world is literally walking above your head, and to choose to spend your final, labored breaths singing a song of peace. It is an act of spiritual rebellion so beautiful and so pure that it completely eclipses the darkness that surrounded them. The people in those subterranean rooms did not surrender. They retreated into the deepest, most inaccessible fortress imaginable, the sanctuary of unconditional love. They held each other. They comforted the weak. They soothed the frightened. They proved that even when buried beneath the earth, the human spirit cannot be smothered. Listen closely to the silence now. Beneath the echoes of history, beneath the heavy weight of the tragedy, there is a softer, much more enduring sound. It is the gentle, swaying rhythm of a whispered song in the dark. It is the sound of a mother rocking her child, creating a universe of safety out of nothing but her own voice. It is a lullaby that never truly ended, a quiet, eternal testament to a people who chose to face the ultimate dark wrapped entirely in the unyielding light of each other's love. Let their song carry you now, a gentle reminder that even in the deepest night, love remains the brightest, most inextinguishable spark of all. Sleep now, and let their quiet courage be your peace. Imagine a silence so deep and so profound that you can actually hear the soft, weightless tumbling of ash as it drifts down from a pale, quiet sky. There comes a moment, after the longest and most terrible storms have finally exhausted themselves, when the world simply stops. The heavy, rushing winds die down to a gentle breath. The roaring fires that had painted the night sky in harsh, violent hues finally consume the last of their fuel, sinking down into a soft, glowing red before fading entirely away. What is left behind is a landscape completely transformed. It is no longer a bustling city of brick and glass, of hurried footsteps and chaotic markets. It has become a hushed, monochrome dreamscape, entirely still, wrapped in a blanket of the most profound and unimaginable quiet. Look up at the sky. It is not the bright, clear blue of a summer morning, nor is it the heavy, suffocating black of a terrified night. It is a soft, swirling canvas of silver and gray. And from this sky, a gentle snow is falling. But it is not cold. It is a steady, mesmerizing drift of pale gray flakes, dancing and spiraling in the slow currents of the air. It is ash. It falls with a surreal, breathtaking grace, coating the jagged edges of the broken walls, settling softly onto the empty cobblestones, rounding out the harshness of the ruin and turning the entire world into a quiet, sleeping garden. Deep beneath the surface of this hushed world, beneath the layers of fallen stone and bent iron, a shadow shifts. A heavy, charred wooden beam is pushed aside with a slow, deliberate effort. From the mouth of a hidden, subterranean cellar, a solitary figure emerges into the cool, gray light. He is a young man, though his eyes hold the weary, boundless depth of an ancient traveler. His clothes are worn and covered in a fine layer of dust, blending perfectly with the landscape around him. He steps out onto the street, his boots sinking softly into the thick layer of ash. He does not run. He does not hide. There is no longer anyone to hide from, and there is nowhere left to run. He simply stands in the center of what used to be a bustling intersection, and he breathes. The air is cool against his skin. It no longer smells of smoke and fear. It smells like the deep, earthy scent of a hearth that has finally gone cold, a smell that is strangely comforting, like the quiet end of a very long day. He slowly raises his head, tipping his face up toward the swirling gray canopy. He closes his eyes and lets the soft, weightless flakes settle on his cheeks, his eyelashes, his forehead. They do not burn. They are perfectly, wonderfully cool. As they touch his skin, they dissolve into nothingness. In his mind, he does not see them as the remnants of a destroyed city. He chooses, with a beautiful, quiet defiance, to see them as petals. They are gray petals falling from an invisible, celestial orchard, drifting down to cover the scars of the earth. He begins to walk. Every step he takes is muffled by the soft blanket on the ground. It is as if he is walking on clouds, suspended in a space entirely outside of time. The terrifying, rhythmic thud of marching boots that had haunted his dreams for so long is completely gone. The agonizing shouts, the weeping, the desperate whispers, all of it has been swallowed by the immense, oceanic silence. For the first time in what feels like a lifetime, his mind is entirely, beautifully quiet. As he drifts through the ghostly streets, a remarkable thing begins to happen. The physical ruins around him begin to soften, overlaid by the vivid, colorful tapestry of his memory. He does not look at a pile of collapsed red bricks and see destruction. He looks at it, and he sees the bakery that used to stand there. In the center of his mind, the ovens are still warm. He can clearly see the baker, a stout, cheerful man with a magnificent white mustache, dusting his wooden counter with a cloud of bright white flour. He can smell the sweet, yeasty aroma of braided challah bread cooling on the racks. The ash falling around him is just the flour, drifting through the air on a Friday afternoon. He walks a few steps further, turning down a narrow, winding alleyway. The walls on either side are crumbling, but he does not see the cracks. He sees the vibrant, chaotic beauty of the flower market that used to bloom here every spring. He remembers the older woman who sat on a small wooden stool, surrounded by buckets of bright yellow tulips, deep red roses, and fragrant blue lilacs. He remembers the way the morning sun used to catch the droplets of water on the petals, making them sparkle like tiny diamonds. He stops walking and slowly reaches out his hand, letting his fingertips brush against the empty air where the tulips used to be. He can almost feel the smooth, cool surface of the green leaves. He realizes, with a profound and gentle clarity, that the beauty of this place has not been erased. It has simply retreated into the safest, most indestructible vault in the universe, his own heart. As long as he is breathing, the flower market is still open. As long as he is walking, the baker is still baking. The city is alive within him, perfectly preserved, untouched by the fires and the fear. He wanders into a wide, open courtyard. The ground here is smooth and entirely covered in the gray snow. In the very center of the space, something catches his eye. It is a tiny splash of color, almost invisible against the monochrome landscape. He walks toward it slowly, respectfully, as if approaching a sacred altar. He kneels down in the ash. Half buried in the soft gray powder is a small, ceramic teacup. Miraculously, it is completely unbroken. It is painted with a delicate, winding vine of tiny blue flowers. It is such an ordinary, fragile thing, an object meant for quiet conversations and warm afternoons. He reaches down and gently brushes the ash away from the rim. He lifts the teacup, cradling it in his dust-covered hands. It is light, almost weightless. He holds it close to his chest. He does not know who it belonged to. He does not know what conversations were shared over its rim. But he feels a sudden, overwhelming wave of tenderness for the hands that once held it. He takes a piece of soft cloth from his pocket, carefully wraps the delicate ceramic, and places it close to his heart. It is a small rescue, a quiet victory. He has saved a single, beautiful piece of their world. He remains kneeling in the center of the courtyard, and he looks back up at the sky. And then, the heavens offer him a fleeting, breathtaking gift. The thick, swirling canvas of gray clouds suddenly parts, just for a fraction of a second. A single, distinct beam of pale, silver sunlight breaks through the canopy. It reaches down like a gentle hand, illuminating the courtyard where he kneels. In that beam of light, the falling ash is entirely transformed. The flakes catch the silver rays and begin to glow. They sparkle and shimmer, turning into thousands of tiny, floating fireflies, dancing in the quiet air. The gray world is suddenly bathed in a soft, ethereal luminescence. In this brief, beautiful moment, the young man experiences a feeling he thought he had forgotten forever. It washes over him like a warm, soothing tide, easing the tight knots of tension in his shoulders, unclenching the weary muscles of his jaw. It is peace. It is a pure, absolute, and unconditional peace. He is completely alone in a ruined city, yet he does not feel lonely. He feels surrounded by the enduring love of everyone who once walked these streets. He realizes that the ash falling upon him is not a symbol of an end. It is the physical manifestation of all their prayers, all their whispered lullabies, all their secret hopes and quiet courage. The city has not been destroyed, it has been distilled. It has been lifted into the air, transformed into something weightless and pure, and now it is gently settling back down, tucking the earth in for a long, deeply deserved rest. He closes his eyes and lets the silver light warm his face. He speaks to them in his mind, a silent, flowing letter sent into the quiet air. I am still here, he whispers to the ghosts of the cobblestones. I am breathing for you. I am watching the snow fall for you. I have the little blue teacup, and I will keep it safe. Do not worry anymore. The noise has stopped. The pain has stopped. You can rest now. You can sleep in the quiet garden. I will walk through these streets, and I will carry your memories like lanterns in the dark. As long as my heart is beating, none of you are truly gone. The clouds slowly close again, and the beam of silver sunlight fades back into the soft, swirling gray. But the profound peace remains. It has settled deep within his chest, a quiet, unshakable anchor. He opens his eyes. He is in no hurry to move. He sits back on the soft ground, crossing his legs, completely comfortable in the silence. He watches the petals fall, mesmerizing and slow. He watches them cover the broken bricks, watches them smooth the jagged lines of the world. The city is being gently tucked under a heavy, protective blanket. There is no fear left in this place. There is only the quiet breathing of a lone survivor, a man who has looked into the very heart of the dark and found a strange, enduring light. He is a living monument of love, sitting peacefully in the gray snow, watching the sky, and finding a beautiful, poetic rest in the gentle, falling ash. Let his quiet breathing be a comfort to you now. Let the soft, falling petals carry away your worries, leaving only the deep, soothing silence of a world entirely at peace. Listen to the steady, comforting sound of a heartbeat, strong and unwavering, even as the world around it slowly fades into the quiet dark. Deep beneath the ruined, ash-covered streets, far below the reach of the burning sun and the heavy footsteps of history, there was a hidden room. It was nestled beneath a street that used to hum with the ordinary, beautiful sounds of a waking city, a place simply called Mila. Now, the world above was a tapestry of smoke and fractured stone, but down here, in the cool, damp embrace of the earth, a strange and profound peace had finally settled. This subterranean space was not a fortress of cold iron. It was a sanctuary, a quiet bubble suspended in time, holding within its earthen walls the very bravest, most tender hearts that had ever dared to dream. Imagine stepping softly down into this space. The air is thick, carrying the scent of damp clay and old dust, but it is also incredibly warm. It is warmed by the breath of a few dozen young men and women, huddled closely together in the dim, wavering light of a single, nearly exhausted candle. These are not soldiers in the way the world understands the word. They wear no uniforms, they have no medals pinned to their chests. They are students, poets, tailors, and dreamers. They are youths who, just a few springs ago, were worried only about the ink staining their fingers from a long night of studying, or the flutter in their chests when they caught the eye of a sweetheart across a crowded courtyard. In the center of this quiet circle sits a young man named Mordecai. If you were to look at him now, bathed in the soft, golden glow of the candlelight, you would not see a hardened commander. You would see a boy with immensely kind, deeply tired eyes. His face is smudged with the ash of the world above, his clothes are torn, but there is a radiant, unshakable calm resting upon his shoulders. He looks around the room at the faces of his dearest friends, and his heart swells with an overwhelming, absolute love. They have been down here for days, hidden entirely from the sun. The provisions are gone. The water is gone. The air itself is growing thin, making every breath a slow, deliberate act. Yet, there is no panic in this room. There is no frantic searching for a way out. They have reached the very end of their long, agonizing journey, and they have arrived not with terror, but with a quiet, breathtaking dignity. Watch the small, beautiful moments passing between them in the shadows. A young woman leans her head against the stone wall, her eyes closed. Her companion, a boy who has loved her since they were children playing in the snow, gently reaches out. He uses the edge of his worn sleeve to softly brush a streak of dirt from her cheek. She opens her eyes, looks at him, and offers a fragile, deeply grateful smile. They do not need to speak. In that simple, gentle touch, an entire lifetime of devotion is communicated. Across the room, two friends are sharing a whispered memory. They are talking about a summer day from long ago, remembering the taste of sweet strawberries and the feeling of the warm sun on their backs as they swam in a clear, winding river. Their voices are a soft, soothing murmur, a gentle melody that pushes back the heavy silence of the bunker. They are deliberately filling the room with beauty, refusing to let the darkness dictate their final thoughts. They are wrapping each other in the warm, protective blanket of their shared history. Mordecai reaches into the pocket of his tattered coat and pulls out a small, folded piece of paper and the dull stub of a pencil. He moves slightly closer to the dying candle. He wants to write one last letter to a friend who is far away, outside the walls. He wants to leave a record, not of the sorrow, but of the immense, towering pride he feels in his heart. Listen to the soft scratching of his pencil against the paper. He writes slowly, his hand moving with a calm, deliberate grace. He does not write of hatred or despair. He writes about a dream. The dream of my life has risen to become fact, he writes, his internal voice a gentle, rhythmic whisper in the dark. I have lived to see the day where we did not bow our heads. We looked up. We stood together, a quiet, beautiful forest of trees refusing to bend to the storm. He pauses, looking up from the paper to watch his friends. He sees their exhaustion, but he also sees the magnificent, unbroken light of their spirits. He feels a profound, deeply humbling gratitude that he was allowed to walk this path beside them. My last wish has been fulfilled, he continues, his handwriting small and neat. I have seen our quiet dignity bloom in the shadows. I am completely at peace. The spring will come again, my friend. The sun will rise, and the flowers will return to these broken streets. Do not weep for us in the years to come. Simply remember that we loved each other, and that we chose to leave this world holding fast to the beautiful, fragile truth of who we were. He folds the letter carefully, smoothing the creases with his thumb. He knows, with a quiet certainty, that this piece of paper is a whisper sent into the vast unknown, a paper boat set adrift on an ocean of night. But the act of writing it has settled his soul entirely. He places it back into his pocket, keeping it close to his heart. As the hours gently drift by, the air in the bunker grows heavier. The sounds from the world above, the muffled, distant thuds and the scraping of heavy boots, tell them that the sanctuary has been found. The final door is slowly, inevitably closing. But there is no sudden rush to the exits. There are no cries of anguish. Instead, a profound, almost sacred silence falls over the group. It is the silence of absolute acceptance, the quiet grace of a leaf finally letting go of the branch and drifting softly toward the earth. They look at each other in the dim light. They understand the choice that lies before them. To wait for the heavy iron doors to be forced open is to surrender the final, precious piece of their autonomy. It is to hand the ending of their story over to those who only know how to write in cruelty. And so, these gentle dreamers, these poets and students, make their final, most deeply personal choice. They decide to close the book themselves. They decide to step into the quiet dark on their own terms, completely untethered from the violence of the world above. The farewells in that subterranean room are the most tender, heartbreakingly beautiful moments the earth has ever witnessed. There are no grand speeches. There is only the soft, rustling sound of people moving closer to one another. Mordecai stands up slowly, his movements calm and deliberate. He walks to his closest friend, a young man who has stood by his side through the freezing winters and the burning spring. They embrace. It is a long, tight embrace, two weary souls holding each other up one last time. Mordecai rests his chin on his friend's shoulder, closes his eyes, and whispers a gentle, heartfelt thank you. Thank you for the shared bread. Thank you for the whispered jokes in the dark. Thank you for the gift of your presence. All around the room, friends are wrapping their arms around each other. Young women hold hands, their fingers tightly intertwined, leaning their heads against one another like sleeping birds. They whisper their final I love yous into the damp air. They forgive small, forgotten grievances. They bless each other with the quiet, profound love of a family chosen in the crucible of sorrow. They are creating a circle of absolute warmth, an impenetrable fortress of affection. They are taking all the love they would have spent over long, full lifetimes, all the love they would have given to their children, to their future spouses, to the world they will never see, and they are pouring it entirely into this single, suspended moment. When the time comes, they do not hesitate, and they do not tremble. They have agreed that they will not let the heavy boots above be the last sound they hear. They will not let the harsh shouts of strangers be their final memory. They lay down gently on the cool earth, finding comfortable places beside the people they cherish most in the world. They pull their thin coats over themselves like soft blankets. They reach out and hold hands, forming a continuous, unbroken chain of humanity across the dark floor. The young woman, Mira, rests her head on her companion's chest, listening to the steady, fading rhythm of his heart. She closes her eyes and imagines she is lying in a wide, green meadow, the summer grass swaying in a warm breeze. She imagines the blue sky stretching endlessly above her, completely empty of clouds. Mordecai lies near the center, his hand resting gently over the pocket that holds his final letter. He looks at the single candle, its wax entirely melted, the tiny yellow flame sputtering softly, dancing its final, fragile waltz. He breathes in the silence of the room. It is no longer the silence of fear. It is a vast, oceanic peace. He feels an incredible lightness washing over his weary body. The heavy burden he has carried for so long, the desperate need to protect, to endure, to survive another day, is finally lifted from his shoulders. He does not have to be strong anymore. He can simply rest. He whispers a final, soft goodnight to his friends. The words flutter through the dark like gentle moths, landing softly on the ears of his companions. One by one, they close their eyes. They let their breathing slow. They do not fight the encroaching dark, they welcome it like a soft, familiar blanket. They step out of the pain, out of the hunger, out of the terrifying noise of history, and they walk quietly, hand in hand, into a vast, unblemished light that belongs entirely to them. The little candle in the center of the room flickers one last time, a tiny spark of gold, and then it quietly goes out. The bunker of Mila 18 falls completely, beautifully silent. It is a silence so deep, so profound, that it instantly becomes holy. When the world above eventually breaks through the stone, they will not find defeated prisoners. They will find a room full of sleeping dreamers, their hands still clasped together, their faces smooth and entirely at peace. They will find a monument to the ultimate triumph of the human spirit, the magnificent, unbreakable truth that even in the very heart of the darkest night, we can still choose to leave the world wrapped in the quiet, gentle dignity of love. Hold this silence with them now. Let their peaceful rest wash over you. Let their beautiful, quiet courage be a soothing balm to your own heart, a gentle reminder that love is the only thing that truly outlasts the dark. Sleep well, surrounded by the echoes of their unbroken light. Imagine a world made entirely of echoes, where the deepest silence is kept company only by the gentle wind moving through broken stone. After the great fires finally burned themselves out, and the heavy smoke slowly dissolved into the vast and different sky, the walled city did not disappear. It simply changed its form. The towering apartment blocks, the bustling bakeries, and the hidden, subterranean cellars all collapsed into a great, rolling ocean of shattered red brick and gray ash. To the eyes of the outside world, it was a flattened wasteland, a closed chapter, a place where life had entirely ceased to be. The sun would rise, cast its golden light across miles of jagged, dusty ruins, and set again without finding a single soul to warm. But if you were to stand very still in the center of that ruined sea, and if you waited for the moon to cast its soft, silver glow over the broken world, you would discover a profound, impossible secret. The city was still breathing. Deep beneath the shifting dunes of rubble, hidden in the tiny, accidental cavities left by fallen iron beams and collapsed staircases, a handful of gentle spirits still lingered. They were the ultimate survivors, the quietest souls on earth, known only as the rubble weeders. They had become entirely one with the ruins, their clothes the color of dust, their movements as slow and silent as the shifting shadows. For these few, the world above had become a place of absolute stillness. The day was for sleeping, for curling into a tight, invisible ball in the dark, pressing their cheeks against the cool, damp earth. But when the night fell, and the stars emerged like tiny, hopeful lamps in the black canopy above, the rubble weeders would slowly, carefully, push back the debris and emerge into the moonlight. They did not walk, they drifted. They stepped with barefoot reverence over the jagged bricks, their bodies so light and fragile they seemed to barely touch the ground. They were searching for the tiniest drops of water, for a forgotten scrap of food, but more than anything, they were searching for the echoes of what they had lost. In a small hollow beneath what used to be a grand library, a man named Elias made his home. His room was no larger than a closet, framed by a slanted slab of concrete that protected him from the rain. He had no blankets, no fire, and no light. But Elias was not alone. Every night, as he sat in the absolute dark, he would close his eyes and invite his ghosts to join him. These were not the frightening specters of a nightmare. They were the beautiful, radiant memories of his family. He would lean his head back against the cold stone, and he would begin to speak to his wife, Sarah, in a voice no louder than a sigh. He would tell her about the shape of the clouds he had seen through a crack in the rubble that afternoon. He would ask her if she remembered the day they walked by the river, years ago, when the wind caught her hat and carried it into the water. In the quiet of his hidden cave, he could hear her laughter perfectly. It was a clear, ringing sound that warmed the freezing air around him. He would wrap his arms around his own thin shoulders, and in the profound power of his memory, he could actually feel the weight of her arms holding him back. He did not survive on bread or water. He survived on the intricate, endlessly replayed memories of his love. When the loneliness threatened to crush his chest, he would rebuild his old apartment in his mind, brick by brick, placing every book on the shelf, every teacup on the table, every smile on the faces of his children. He lived inside his own heart, a sanctuary entirely untouched by the destruction above. A few streets away, across a perilous landscape of twisted metal, a young woman named Hannah lived in the remains of a cellar. She was the quiet caretaker of the vanished. During her nightly wanderings under the stars, she would sift through the ash with her bare hands, moving with the delicate care of an archaeologist uncovering a sacred temple. She was looking for pieces of the lives that had been interrupted. One night, her fingers brushed against something smooth in the dirt. It was a single, small wooden button. Another night, she found the bent, silver handle of a teaspoon. And once, a miracle in the dust, she uncovered a tiny, porcelain figurine of a white dove, entirely unbroken. Hannah brought these treasures back to her cellar. She lined them up perfectly on a flat piece of stone, a beautiful, heartbreaking museum of the ordinary. She would sit for hours looking at the wooden button, imagining the coat it belonged to, the mother who had sewn it, the child who had worn it to keep warm. By holding these tiny objects, she was reaching out across the void, holding the hands of strangers, promising them that their existence mattered, that the physical proof of their lives would be honored and kept safe in the dark. These solitary survivors rarely saw one another. The ruins were vast, and safety depended on absolute isolation. But there were moments, fleeting and breathtaking, when their paths would cross in the moonlight. Imagine a night when the moon is hidden behind thick, gray clouds, casting the rubble into deep shadow. Elias is creeping slowly toward a broken pipe he knows still drips a few precious drops of water into a rusted puddle. He moves on his hands and knees, making no more noise than a falling leaf. As he nears the pipe, he freezes. His heart skips a beat. Just a few feet away, another shadow is kneeling by the water. It is Hannah. For a long, terrifying second, neither of them breathes. The instinct of the hunted is to flee, to disappear back into the safety of the rocks. But slowly, the moonlight breaks through the clouds, illuminating their dust-covered faces. Elias looks at Hannah. Hannah looks at Elias. They see in each other's hollow, weary eyes the exact same ocean of sorrow, the exact same quiet endurance. Elias does not run. He slowly lowers his head in a gesture of profound, silent respect. He presses himself flat against the rubble, offering her the water. He is telling her, without a single word, that her life is as precious to him as his own. Hannah looks at the rusted puddle, and then she looks back at Elias. She takes a small, broken tin cup from her pocket, fills it with the murky water, and carefully sets it on a flat stone halfway between them. She takes a step back, melting into the shadows. Elias crawls forward, his hands trembling. He takes the cup. He drinks the water, and it tastes like the sweetest, most magnificent wine in the history of the world. It is the taste of pure, unadulterated human kindness. In a landscape that has been entirely stripped of humanity, they have just shared a moment of absolute grace. They are two ghosts, two shadows, reminding each other that the gentle, beating heart of their people has not yet stopped. As the long months dragged on, the seasons began to shift over the ruined city. The autumn rains came, a soft, persistent drizzle that washed the gray ash from the red bricks, leaving the rubble slick and dark. The water seeped down into their hidden hollows, making the earth damp and cold. But the rubble weeders did not despair. They found comfort in the sound of the rain. To Elias, the gentle tapping of the water against the concrete above his head sounded like the rhythmic, soothing ticking of his grandfather's old pocket watch. It was a lullaby sung by the sky, rocking him into a deep, peaceful sleep. He would lie on his back, listening to the rain, and he would imagine that the water was washing away the pain of the city. He imagined that the tears of the heavens were sinking deep into the soil, nurturing the buried seeds of the chestnut trees and the lilacs, promising that one day, long after he was gone, the green leaves would push through the broken stones and reclaim the earth. He felt a profound, transcendent peace. He knew that he might not live to see the spring. He knew that his body was failing, growing lighter and more translucent with every passing day. But he was no longer afraid of the end. He had lived longer than the walls. He had outlasted the fire. And most importantly, he had kept the memory of his wife and his children perfectly safe, held tightly in the indestructible vault of his soul. When he closed his eyes at night, the ruined walls around him would simply fade away. The damp smell of the earth would be replaced by the scent of fresh pine and baking bread. The ghosts in the rubble would gather around him, not as shadows, but as brilliant, radiant beings of light. They would sit with him in his hidden cave, keeping him warm. They would sing the old songs, their voices perfectly harmonized, a beautiful, invisible choir rising up through the cracks in the stone and floating into the night sky. And Hannah, in her cellar, would listen to the rain and polish her little porcelain dove with the edge of her sleeve. She felt the presence of the strangers who had left their treasures behind, standing quietly in the corners of her room, watching over her with immense, protective love. She was not a lonely girl hiding in the dirt. She was the honored guardian of a sacred trust. They were the keepers of the flame, holding a tiny, flickering spark of love in a world that had tried to blow it out. They asked for nothing from the universe except the quiet right to remember. Think of them now, not with sorrow, but with a deep, soothing awe. Think of the immense, towering strength it takes to build a home entirely out of memories, to find beauty in a broken porcelain bird, to offer a cup of water to a stranger in the dark. Their bodies were fragile, but their spirits were made of something entirely unbreakable. They were woven from the threads of ancient prayers, of whispered lullabies, and of a love so profound that it could survive beneath a mountain of stone. Let the image of their quiet resilience settle into your own heart. Let it wrap around you like a soft, warm blanket. If they could find a gentle peace beneath the flattened ruins of their world, then surely there is a quiet, safe place waiting for you and yours. Listen to the soft, rhythmic sound of the autumn rain falling on the stones. Let it wash away the worries of your day. Let the silence of the night hold you, just as the hidden earth held them, in a perfect, loving embrace. The ghosts in the rubble are not weeping. They are resting. They are dreaming of the spring. Close your eyes, breathe in the deep, peaceful quiet, and let yourself rest alongside them. Imagine the quiet, steady movement of a heavy brass pendulum, swinging softly in the dark, slowly and inevitably bringing a tilted world back to its center. There is a profound, exhausted stillness that follows the end of a very long, terrible storm. For years, the earth had trembled beneath the weight of heavy boots and the deafening roar of a cruelty so vast it seemed it would swallow the sun forever. The skies had been thick with the smoke of vanished tomorrows, and the nights had been completely devoid of stars. But time, in its infinite, gentle patience, is a river that never stops flowing. Eventually, the loudest thunder must roll away into the distance. Eventually, the heavy, dark clouds must break. And when the skies finally cleared over the shattered, quiet landscapes of Europe, the world had to learn how to open its eyes and simply breathe again. In the gentle, hesitating light of this new dawn, the universe began the slow, delicate work of restoring its balance. When an unimaginable weight of sorrow has been violently slammed onto one side of the scale, the world does not right itself through more violence. The loud, chaotic clamor of revenge is afire, and the earth had already seen entirely too much burning. True justice is not a sword, it is a quiet, undeniable gravity. It is the soft, certain turning of the autumn leaves, falling to the ground to nourish the soil. It is the steady, unyielding light of the morning chasing away the darkest shadows of the night. In the aftermath of the silence, the men who had cast those longest, darkest shadows over the walled city of Warsaw were finally pulled into the light. During the deepest, most terrifying days of the dark, these men had seemed like invincible titans. Jürgen and Franz. They had stood on high, wrought-iron balconies with their polished leather boots and their immaculate uniforms, pointing their gloved fingers and believing they could command the very wind to stop blowing. They had drafted the blueprints of heartbreak, drawing sharp, cruel lines across a map, believing they were the permanent authors of a new, absolute darkness. They thought they had entirely rewritten the rules of humanity. But illusions of absolute power are as fragile as dry leaves in a winter gale. When the walls of their empire finally crumbled, the grand, terrifying facade entirely washed away. When the end of the road arrived for these men, it did not come with the dramatic, sweeping thunder they had so callously unleashed upon the innocent. It came softly, almost remarkably quiet. They were found hiding in the shifting debris of a broken world, stripped of their medals, stripped of their titles, and stripped of the terrifying machinery that had magnified their shadows. They were no longer the architects of history. They were simply ordinary, frightened men, made suddenly, profoundly aware of their own frail, human smallness. Imagine the news of their capture drifting across the world, carried not on shouts of triumph, but on the quiet, crackling static of wireless radios and small, dimly lit kitchens. In a quiet apartment in a newly peaceful city, an older man sits by a window. Let us call him Leviticus. He is wrapped in a thick, woolen cardigan, holding a warm porcelain cup of tea between his trembling hands. Outside his window, a soft, steady rain is falling, blurring the lights of the street lamps into gentle, glowing halos. He listens to the voice on the radio announcing that the men who had commanded the destruction of his home, the men who had taken the lives of his beloved wife and his gentle, bright-eyed son, have been captured and judged. Watch Lev's face in the dim light. He does not stand up. He does not cheer or raise his fist in victory. The capture of these men cannot bring back the sweet, yeasty smell of the bread his wife used to bake. It cannot bring back the sound of his son's laughter echoing in the courtyard. Instead, Lev takes a slow, deep, trembling breath, and he lets it out into the quiet room. He reaches out and gently touches a faded, sepia photograph resting on his windowsill. It is a picture of his family, smiling in a sunlit park from a lifetime ago. He traces the outline of his wife's face with his thumb. "The storm is over, my love," he whispers to the photograph, his voice entirely soft, carrying only the weight of a profound, enduring weariness. "The men who built our nightmare are fading into the dust. The scales are settling. But you are still here with me. You are still shining in the light." For Lev, and for thousands of others who carried the invisible, heavy scars of the walled city, the judgment of these men was not about vengeance. It was a profound, necessary exhale. It was the closing of a heavy, iron door. It was the universe whispering, "The world is safe again. The rules of kindness and humanity have returned. You can rest now." The men who had caused so much weeping were brought back to the very earth they had tried to break. They were returned to the city of Warsaw, a city that was slowly, bravely beginning to pull away the rubble and plant new seeds in the ash. When their final moments came, there was no grand audience, no sweeping orchestra to mark their departure. There was only a quiet room, a courtyard, a simple, unavoidable consequence. The heavy scales of history tipped gently, silently back to the center. The breath left their bodies, entirely unremarkable, returning to the wind. The loud, terrifying chapters they had tried to permanently etch into the earth were simply closed, bound, and placed on the dusty, forgotten shelves of the past, never to hold power over the waking world again. They were erased. And in their erasure, the true, enduring beauty of the people they had tried to destroy shone brighter than ever before. Because what remains when the architects of sorrow are gone? Look at the legacy they left behind. The oppressors are remembered only as empty shadows, cold footnotes in a textbook, entirely devoid of love, of warmth, of anything that makes a human soul beautiful. Their names dissolve into the quiet void, leaving nothing but the cold ash of their own hubris. But the victims? The gentle, beautiful people of the walled city? Their legacy is entirely different. They are not defined by the men who took their lives, they are defined by the immense, towering light of how they lived. Their legacy is the warmth of the Friday night candles, still flickering in the memory of the world. Their legacy is the profound, breathtaking courage of a mother dividing a single piece of dark bread, smiling so her children would not be afraid. Their legacy is the quiet, secret letters buried deep in the milk cans, waiting patiently beneath the earth to tell the future about the poems they wrote and the dreams they harbored. Their legacy is the hushed lullaby sung in the stifling dark of a subterranean bunker, a song of pure, unconditional love that outlasted the burning of an entire city. Somewhere, on a soft spring morning years after the quiet execution of the generals, a woman kneels in a patch of fresh, dark earth. She survived the walls, she survived the deep cold, and she carried the memory of her lost sister in her heart every single day. She uses a small iron trowel to dig a hole in the soft dirt. The sun is warm on her back, and a gentle breeze rustles the newly blossomed leaves of the trees around her. She takes a small, fragile sapling, a cherry tree, and carefully places its delicate roots into the earth. She scoops the dark, rich soil over the roots, patting it down firmly with her bare hands. She pours a small watering can over the base, watching the earth drink in the moisture. She knows that the men who cast the shadows have faced their quiet end. She knows that the scales have balanced. But as she kneels in the dirt, her hands covered in the life-giving soil, she is not thinking of them. She is thinking of her sister. She is thinking of the way her sister loved the taste of sweet, dark cherries in the summer. "Grow tall, my little tree," she whispers to the sapling, her voice a soothing, melodious hum. "Grow deep into the earth, and reach up for the sun. Blossom beautifully, so the whole world can see." This is the ultimate, magnificent justice. It is not found in the quiet demise of the cruel, it is found in the stubborn, beautiful persistence of the loving. The roots digging deep into the earth, entirely defying the ash of the past. The branches reaching up to the open sky, claiming the sunlight that was meant for them all along. The universe has righted itself. The heavy brass pendulum has swung back to the center, resting in the quiet, absolute stillness of peace. The monsters of the past have been gently, entirely swept away by the broom of time, returning the night to its rightful owners, the dreamers, the lovers, the gentle souls who only wish to sleep in safety. You can rest now, knowing that the scales of the world always, eventually, bend toward the light. The dark chapters are closed. The quiet, gentle heroes of the walled city are safe in the indestructible sanctuary of memory, their love entirely untouched, their dignity forever preserved. Listen to the soft, steady rhythm of the rain against the window pane, or the gentle rustle of leaves in the night air. It is the sound of the earth breathing easily again. It is the sound of a world restored. Let the profound, quiet peace of this balanced universe wash over you, smoothing away the worries of the day, and wrapping you in a blanket of absolute, enduring calm. Sleep well, completely secure in the beautiful, unyielding light of a restored world. Watch the soft, trembling flame of a single candle as it dances gently in the dark, holding back the night with nothing but its own quiet warmth. Many years have folded over the earth since those heavy red brick walls finally crumbled into the dust. The great, slow-turning wheel of the seasons has brought countless springs to the city, washing the cobblestones with warm, cleansing rains and blanketing the rooftops in the soft, silent snows of winter. Above the ground where the shadows once fell so heavily, modern life now hums with a peaceful, ordinary rhythm. Tall green trees reach their leafy branches up toward a wide, open, and unburdened sky. Children with bright, carefree eyes run through sunlit parks, their laughter echoing freely in the open air, completely untethered from the fears of the past. The world has moved forward, spinning gently on its axis, wrapped in the soothing embrace of time. But if you walk through those streets as the evening light turns to a deep, bruised velvet, and the city begins to quiet itself for sleep, you can still feel a profound, invisible presence. It is not a haunting. It is a holy, beautiful lingering. Beneath the modern pavement, beneath the roots of the new chestnut trees, the echoes of a vanished world remain. They are sleeping peacefully in the earth, waiting only for the gentle touch of our remembrance to wake them. When we look back at the immense, shadowed tapestry of those years, it is so easy to be overwhelmed by the sheer, towering scale of the dark. It is easy to look at the ruins and see only the broken stone. But that is not how they would want to be remembered. They did not spend their final days defining themselves by the cruelty that surrounded them. They defined themselves by the love they stubbornly, fiercely generated from within. To truly remember them, we must not look into the darkness. We must look at the light. We must look closely at the thousands of tiny, individual sparks that refuse to be extinguished. We must remember the weary mother, standing by a cold stove in the dead of winter, weaving magnificent, colorful tales of summer orchards just to see a smile bloom on her hungry child's face. We must remember the quiet, dignified old men with silver beards, sitting in drafty rooms, swaying gently as they whispered ancient prayers, keeping the soul of their people warm. We must remember the young girl who found a broken, stubby pencil and used it to write a poem about a yellow butterfly on the back of a torn ration card, proving that her imagination was entirely free. We must remember the gentle hands of the orphanage doctor, smoothing the collars of his little ones, walking them with absolute, majestic pride toward the unknown. These were not merely victims of a terrible storm. They were candles in the wind. The wind that blew through their streets was colder and more violent than anything the world had ever seen. It sought to blow out every single flame, to leave the earth entirely dark and silent. And in a physical sense, the wind was terribly strong. The bodies were fragile. The rooms were drafted. The breath was stolen away. But light is a miraculous, unbreakable thing. When a candle burns, even for a short time, the light it casts does not simply disappear when the flame goes out. The photons travel outward, moving endlessly through the vast, quiet universe. The warmth it created in a cold room becomes a permanent part of the history of the world. The wind can extinguish the wick, but it can never, ever unshine the light. Imagine a quiet room tonight, somewhere far away from the noise of the busy world. A woman sits alone at a small wooden table. The house is completely silent, save for the soft, rhythmic ticking of a clock on the mantel. She reaches out and takes a long, wooden match. She strikes it against the box, the sudden, sharp hiss breaking the quiet, followed instantly by the bright, blooming yellow of a tiny fire. She touches the match to the white wick of a memorial candle, watching as the flame hesitates for a fraction of a second before taking hold, standing tall and steady. She turns off the electric lamp, leaving the room bathed entirely in the soft, golden, flickering amber glow of the candle. She sits back in her chair, folds her hands in her lap, and she simply watches the flame. She does not have a specific face in her mind. She is not recalling a name from a history book. She is simply holding space in her heart for the strangers who walk those walled streets. As she stares into the warm light, the distance between the past and the present gently dissolves. Time becomes entirely flat, a vast, quiet ocean where all souls are floating peacefully together. In the mesmerizing dance of the candle flame, she can almost hear them. It is not the sound of weeping. It is the soothing, everyday murmur of a vibrant life. She hears the rhythmic shhhhshhh of a broom sweeping a wooden floor on a Friday afternoon. She hears the soft clinking of delicate porcelain teacups being set upon a white tablecloth. She hears the hushed, melodic hum of a lullaby being sung in a dark cellar, the mother's voice wrapping around her child like a protective, invisible quilt. By sitting in the quiet, by lighting the candle, this woman is doing something magnificent. She is reaching back through the decades, offering her own warm breath to keep their stories alive. She is whispering into the dark, I see you. I hear you. You are not forgotten. And in return, the ghosts of the walled city are offering her their profound, enduring peace. They are whispering back, do not be sad for us anymore. The winter is over. We are resting in the light. Think of the tremendous, breathtaking victory hidden in the soil. Think of the heavy metal milk cans, buried deep beneath the freezing dirt by the archivists in the dead of night. Those brave, ink-stained hands packed away the soul of their city, sealing their poems, their recipes, their love letters, and their quiet tears into the dark, trusting the earth to hold them safe. And the earth kept its promise. When the cans were finally lifted back into the sunlight years later, the heavy lids pried open by reverent hands, the words were still there. The paper was fragile, delicate as a moth's wing, smelling of damp clay and time. But as human eyes fell upon the faded ink, an absolute miracle occurred. The voices trapped in the dark were suddenly released. The young man who wrote his diary by the light of a dying moon, pouring his lonely heart onto the page, was suddenly speaking directly into the mind of someone sitting in a warm, safe library half a century later. His fear, his hope, his profound humanity leaped off the paper and took root in a new heart. Through the simple, beautiful act of reading, the victims were entirely resurrected. They were given their voices back. The architects of the dark had tried to erase them from the earth, but the writers had quietly, brilliantly outsmarted them. They had hidden their souls inside their words, and their words had survived the fire. As long as we turn those fragile pages, as long as we read their names aloud in the quiet rooms of our own homes, they are never truly gone. They are sitting right beside us, warming their hands by the fire of our memory. This is the ultimate, soaring triumph of the human spirit. It is the realization that love is not a fragile thing. We often think of love as soft, as delicate, as something that can be easily crushed by the heavy machinery of the world. But the story of those quiet streets proves that love is the strongest, most indestructible substance in the entire universe. Hate can build walls of thick red brick. It can forge locks of heavy iron. It can shut out the sun and freeze the water in the pipes. But hate cannot stop a mother from kissing her child's forehead in the dark. It cannot stop a grandfather from dividing his last piece of bread. It cannot stop a young couple from holding hands in the freezing snow, their fingers intertwined, finding absolute, profound warmth in the simple presence of one another. The walls fell. The iron rusted. The men who commanded the destruction have faded into the empty, forgotten dust of history. But the love that was generated inside those cramped, freezing rooms? That love is still echoing. It is still vibrating through the atmosphere. It is the gentle breeze you feel on your face on a warm spring evening. It is the sudden, inexplicable feeling of comfort that washes over you when you look up at a sky full of stars. The people of the walled city did not simply endure. They transcended. They took the absolute worst of human cruelty and answered it with the absolute best of human grace. They built an invisible, eternal fortress out of their own compassion, a sanctuary that no weapon could ever reach. As you lie here now, listening to the quiet rhythm of these words, let the profound peace of their survival wash over you. Let the tension melt away from your shoulders, let the muscles in your face entirely relax. You are safe in the quiet night. The doors are locked, the air is warm, and the world outside is resting. Imagine that you are surrounded by thousands of tiny, flickering candles. They are not floating in the dark, they are resting gently on the calm surface of a vast, still lake. The water perfectly reflects the golden light, doubling the warmth, filling the universe with a soft, glowing amber hue. Each little flame is a beautifully lived life. Each flame is a story of quiet resilience, a whispered lullaby, a shared smile, a held hand. The wind has completely died down. The air is perfectly, wonderfully still. The candles burn with a steady, unwavering brightness, completely unbothered by the shadows at the edges of the water. Breathe in the warmth of that light. Breathe in the incredible, humbling strength of the human heart. If they could find a way to love so deeply in the absolute dark, then surely there is an endless, boundless reservoir of love waiting for you in your own life. You do not need to carry their sorrow. They have set the heavy burden down, and they are resting. They only ask that you carry their light. They ask that you hold your loved ones a little tighter, that you speak a little softer, that you find the breathtaking beauty in the simple, ordinary moments of your day. A warm cup of tea. The feeling of a clean blanket. The quiet sound of rain against the glass. These are not small things, they are the magnificent, fragile treasures of living, the very things they wrote about in their diaries and dreamed about in the dark. Let their memory be a soft, heavy blanket that covers you now. Let the gentle, whispered lullabies of the subterranean rooms drift into your own mind, not as a sound of fear, but as the ultimate sound of safety. A mother's voice, humming in the dark, promising that the monsters cannot reach you, promising that the morning will always, eventually, come. The story is told. The ghosts have been honored. The candle is burning brightly on the windowsill, casting its warm, protective glow across the room. There is nothing left to fear, and nothing left to carry. It is time to close your eyes. It is time to let the quiet, beautiful silence of the night hold you perfectly still. Sleep now, wrapped in the enduring, unbreakable light of the human spirit. Sleep peacefully, knowing that love outlasts everything, that memory is a sanctuary, and that the beautiful, gentle souls of the past are forever safe, forever cherished, and forever resting in the light. Good night.